Rumors of the second arrest have been swirling around this small town for days, and when the name of the person charged became public, well, that hit Tara Grinstead's sister very hard. Bo Dukes now faces allegations he helped his high school buddy bury Tara Grinstead's remains back in 2005.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 cold cases that have been solved in part because of coverage from a podcast. But first, I want to let you know that this video is sponsored by HelloFresh. More on that in a minute, but with that being said, let's get into it. Number 1. Tara Grinstead. On October 24, 2005, in Osceola, Georgia, kids and faculty started filing in to begin a school day at Irwin County High. The bell rang, but one of their teachers, 30-year-old Tara Grinstead, hadn't arrived. Her classroom was still locked and students waited outside. This was highly unusual for the history teacher. She'd never been late, and she certainly would have called if something had come up. Her co-workers called her home but didn't get an answer. Osceola was a small town with a tight-knit community. Tara was single and lived alone. She was working on her PhD in education and kept a busy schedule. She had last been seen on Saturday. A retired pageant queen, she'd been helping young pageant hopefuls on Saturday morning. Later that day, she attended a barbecue with friends and went home around 11 p.m. that night. When law enforcement went to her home, they discovered no signs of forced entry. Her car was in the driveway, but her purse and car keys weren't in the home. Her cell phone was found still plugged in and charging. Nothing looked amiss in the home except a lamp in her bedroom, which was broken. It initially appeared as if she'd gone out, but something that stood out was that her dog had been left in the backyard, and those close to Tara stated that she would never have left her dog out there unattended for an extended period of time. Her cat had also been left unfed. Tara's pets were everything to her, and she would never have left without arranging care for them, and she certainly wouldn't have left her dog outside for multiple days. Detectives knew Tara had returned home after the cookout because the outfit she'd been wearing was found on the floor in her bedroom. For days, local law enforcement searched for Tara. Massive search parties went out every day, and hundreds of tips were followed up with. Many had hoped Tara had simply picked up and run off to start a new life, but those closest to Tara knew that just wasn't in her nature. Neither her bank card nor her credit cards had been used after her disappearance, which was also a sign that she hadn't left her life voluntarily. Tara was extremely busy. In Tara's front yard, a latex glove had been discovered, and this turned into one of the only pieces of evidence found. It led detectives to believe that someone with intimate knowledge of police procedure had abducted Tara. Their lead suspect was Tara's ex-boyfriend, who had retired from the military and had briefly worked as a police officer, though there was no evidence directly connecting him to the case. He also had a strong alibi for that weekend. The other piece of evidence was a business card wedged in Tara's front door. The card had been a local business and also led to a dead end. Eventually, the case went cold. In August 2016, the podcast Up and Vanished aired its first episode. The series focused on Tara's disappearance and became hugely popular across the globe, and it also gotten people talking locally, which in turn reinvigorated the investigation. The podcast interviewed various people in Tara's life, it detailed all the available evidence, and covered some of the local rumors and theories that swirled around Tara's disappearance. 6 months after the first episode aired, a tip came in with critical evidence. Brooke Sheridan had been dating her boyfriend, Bo Dukes, for about a year when she started noticing him behaving differently. It had been a sudden shift starting that summer. She described him as having panic attacks, talks of being suicidal, and general anxiety. On January 10th, he had a panic attack, and this time, Brooke had convinced him to tell her what was bothering him. What he said next shocked her. Bo said that he knew what happened to Tara Grinstead. Bo stated that 2 days after Tara had gone missing, during a massive search, his best friend Ryan Duke called him. Ryan stated he needed help, and during that call, he confessed to murdering Tara Grinstead. Bo claimed that initially he thought Ryan had been joking, but then Ryan revealed he had dumped her body on Bo's grandfather's pecan farm. Ryan then brought him to where Tara's body was, and Bo said he freaked out and asked Ryan what had happened. According to Bo, Ryan stated that he'd been in Tara Grinstead's home looking for things to steal when she came back home. At the time, Ryan was dealing with a severe drug problem and he needed money. He said that when Tara came home, he was still inside, and he attacked her and strangled her to death. Ryan also revealed he had borrowed Bo's truck to transport Tara's body. Both Ryan and Bo knew Tara. They had been students in her class. Bo claimed to have panicked, and he didn't think anyone would have believed that he hadn't been involved in Tara's murder, given the body was on his family's property and Ryan had used his truck. He stated that the two decided to burn Tara's body using firewood from the property, and kept a bonfire going until they couldn't see any remains left, and then they buried the rest and purposely started a wildfire in nearby brush to explain the burn pit. Ryan Duke was arrested, but he claimed it had been Bo who had murdered Tara and he helped Bo move her body, and it had been Bo's idea to burn the body. Bo Dukes was also arrested on charges of concealing a death, evidence tampering, and hindering the apprehension of a criminal. Bo Dukes was able to post bond and later pleaded not guilty despite his earlier confession. Ryan Duke also pleaded not guilty. The two had separate trials. Bo Duke's trial was first in 2019, where he was found guilty of concealing Tara's death, as well as making false statements to law enforcement. He received 25 years in prison.
I did that.
Oh, you did? I'm so sorry. I was talking to Mr. Rigby. Thank you. Will you state your name for the record?
On the advice of counsel, I'll be invoking my Fifth Amendment right not to provide testimony.
How'd you get here today?
On the advice of counsel, I'll be invoking my Fifth Amendment right not to provide testimony today.
Judge, may I introduce Defendant's Exhibit 4? I've already shown it to the state. It's a certified copy of his conviction in the United States District Court, the federal court for conspiracy.
Yes. Are you
Only under our prior objection, Your Honor.
All right. Sure, that'd be fine.
Judge, may I approach the witness?
Sure.
Thank you. Showing you what I've marked as Defendant's Exhibit 4. You can take a look at that. Do you recognize that document?
On the advice of counsel, I will be invoking my Fifth Amendment right not to provide testimony today.
Mr. Duke, do you intend to invoke your Fifth Amendment right to every question?
I do, Your Honor.
Any reason to continue this?
No, Judge.
You be excused.
Ryan Duke's trial was in May 2022. He faced murder and burglary charges as well as aggravated assault charges. He was found not guilty on all charges except he was found guilty on the concealment charge. He was given the maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. The two still face several civil suits. Number 2, Lynette Dawson. The missing person case of Lynette Dawson drew international attention in recent years with the 2018 release of The Teacher's Pet, a podcast that took a deep dive into the suspicious disappearance of an Australian woman in 1982. It was a flurry of media attention that, in part, changed this missing persons case into a murder conviction in August 2022. Lynette Dawson was a 33-year-old mother of 2 when she disappeared from her Sydney home in January 1982. For decades, investigators were not able to build enough of a case to charge anyone in relation to her disappearance or death. Her husband, Chris Dawson, maintained that she had called him 1 week after her disappearance and expressed that she needed time away. According to him, this call meant that Lynette must have left of her own accord to get away and start a new life. But her other family members, especially her daughters, mother, and siblings, were completely unconvinced that their mother would ever leave them on their own accord without any explanation and without ever returning. Then, nearly 40 years later, came the podcast The Teacher's Pet. Listened to by millions around the world, uncovered new evidence and pointed to a few holes in the investigation, as well as things investigators may have gotten wrong. Previous inquiries into her disappearance had concluded that she was killed by a known person, but according to that prosecutor, it was the podcast that finally produced enough evidence to lay charges. Chris Dawson, Lynette's husband, was charged with her murder in 2018. In 2022, he got his day in court. It was clear based on the evidence presented that Chris Dawson had been carrying on an extramarital affair with a former student and babysitter, who he had met as her teacher while working as a high school PE teacher, and that he killed his wife in order to be with the teen. That woman later testified against Dawson, saying that she had been groomed into a relationship with Dawson. She also said that her marriage with Dawson was emotionally and physically abusive, and she escaped as soon as she could with her children. Further evidence showed what Chris Dawson was like behind closed doors. The prosecution dismissed Dawson's claims that his wife had called him after the date of her disappearance as made up by Chris to confuse authorities and remove suspicion from him. There was no proof of the alleged phone call. On August 30th, 2022, the jury found Chris Dawson guilty of first-degree murder. His sentencing has been set for November 11th, 2022. Lynette Dawson's name has finally been cleared, and justice has been delivered, thanks to the power of a true crime podcast.
Christopher Michael Dawson on the charge that on or about 8 January 1982 at Bayview, or elsewhere in the state of New South Wales, you did murder Lynette Dawson. I find you guilty.
But the trial still left Lynette's family with unanswered questions. How did he kill Lynette? Did anyone help him? And where was her body? After 40 years, it is unlikely that they'll be able to find her unless Chris reveals the information.
I'm joined by Greg Sims and his wife Marilyn. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today after everything you've been through. Walking into the Supreme Court of New South Wales this morning, how did you feel?
Incredibly nervous and anxious, and pretty emotional. I think we weren't expecting as many press there, and that was pretty daunting, wasn't it?
Yeah, I thought the press had come out after the verdict, not at the beginning. It was quite daunting seeing everyone waiting for us to come in the door.
Such a huge amount of public interest. I was speaking to people who'd travelled from Queensland, they've travelled from the Central Coast just to be out the front to hear the verdict. How does that make you feel knowing that this story has touched so many people?
Very humbled, which is what Lynn would have felt, incredibly humbled, but so comforted by the amount of support we've had. Right
It's
from
been unbelievable. The people have, as you said, wore pink today to support Lynn, so it's, how can you explain it? It's, I'm still going through shock after hearing the verdict.
Shock. Is it a relief?
Well, 40 years we haven't known what happened to her, and for the judge to say he's been found guilty of murdering Lynn, yeah, it's a hell of a shock.
Can you take us there when he said the word guilty? What happened? Did your eyes well up? Were there goosebumps?
Yeah, I was on the verge of crying, but just to see the sheriff's officers come in and actually handcuff him and him just being led away meekly, that really hit me. Just seeing someone having his life taken away, he's going to wear prison greens for a while.
What did that feel like watching him?
Well, someone said to me if he would have done the right thing earlier on the piece, he would have been out by now. Just tell the truth, and it's just been, what's their favourite word, smoke and mirrors, trying to get us to, or put people off the track.
Do you think you're going to get any more assistance from Chris Dawson now he's sentenced?
that would be our biggest hope, but we don't hold out a lot of hope for it. But we would love that. If he would just tell us where she is, what happened, as painful as that will be, we'll be able to put it to rest. I think her daughters deserve to know what happened.
Number 3, Hae-Min Lee. Now this case isn't solved yet, but the podcast serial has led to enough evidence to be re-examined in this case to release the previously convicted suspect Adnan Syed. His original trial was deemed unconstitutional because the prosecution had withheld critical information from his defense. It was January 13, 1999 when Hae-Min Lee left Woodland High School in Baltimore, Maryland. The 18-year-old was supposed to pick up her cousin from daycare at 3:15 and then meet up with her wrestling team she helped coach at their competition. She never arrived at either location. Her parents reported her missing later that evening, and a search began for her right away. Her friends were contacted by law enforcement, and no one had seen her after she left campus that afternoon around 2:15. Her current boyfriend as well as her ex-boyfriend were also contacted, and neither said that they'd heard from her. Initially, it was believed that Hay had gone to California to see her father, as that was something she'd been talking about a lot recently. Hay came from an immigrant family from South Korea that had a modest, strict, and religious outlook on life, and one that stood out in stark contrast to her American friends. She had kept a lot of secrets from her family. She dated when she wasn't supposed to. She went to parties and wasn't always honest about where she was. But you could probably say that about most teenagers. But Hay was a good kid. She worked a part-time job, kept immaculate grades, had a tight group of friends that were also good kids. Hay was an athlete. She played lacrosse, coached wrestling, and was also in the school's ecology club, French club, and others. She was described as a leader whose happiness was infectious. She was always willing to lend a hand, and she had a heart of gold. She worked hard and always gave her best at everything she did. She wanted to become an optician and worked at LensCrafters after school. Hay was extremely responsible, and it had been unusual for her to go anywhere without telling someone where she was going. Her disappearance had been extremely unusual. What had made her disappearance so confusing was that her car was also missing. It truly seemed as though she had just driven off. Weeks went by with little headway in the investigation into Hay's disappearance. Almost a month later, a body was discovered in Leakin Park, an area in Baltimore notorious for dumping bodies. The body was of a young woman, half buried in a shallow grave. The body was later identified as Hae-Min Lee. Her cause of death was determined to have been strangulation. There had been no evidence of sexual assault. She had been wearing the clothing she had last been seen in. Experts determined she had been murdered the day she went missing, shortly after she had left school that day. After Hay's body was discovered, the Baltimore City Police received an anonymous call to look into Jay Wilds. Detectives picked him up. He had a small criminal history of possession, but was friends with one of their lead suspects, Hay's ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed. After a couple of interviews, Jay eventually confessed that he had first-hand knowledge that Adnan had killed Hay. He claimed that Adnan had told him he was going to murder Hay in a jealous rage, and that Adnan had showed him Hay's body in the trunk of his car. He said that he had blackmailed him into helping him dispose of Hay's body in Leakin Park. Adnan was arrested and maintained his innocence. He claimed that he hadn't seen Hay after she left school that day. He said that he'd seen Jay that day because Jay had borrowed his car. Law enforcement used cell phone records to back up Jay's rendition of events, but that had evolved several times over the years. Adnan Syed was arrested and charged with Hay's murder on February 28, 1999. The following year, Adnan went to trial. His lawyer, Cristina Gutierrez, represented him. Gutierrez was known as a good lawyer, however, she was dealing with several medical issues which may have impacted her performance as legal counsel. A key piece of information that could have changed the trial's outcome was a witness who had backed up Adnan's alibi for the time when law enforcement believed that Hay had been murdered. The witness had come forward herself, but had never been approached by Gutierrez or any other of the legal counsel for Adnan. Adnan was eventually convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, 30-plus years for the murder of Hae-Min Lee, despite no concrete evidence connecting him to the crime. It had been Jay's confession that had sealed his fate with the jury. Jay had been given immunity for cooperation with the prosecution, and we know that the lead detectives on this case knew that Jay was a drug dealer because he admitted so in his confessions. But he was never charged with anything related to those crimes either. Adnan was 17 years old when he first went to prison and spent 23 years there. He and Hay had dated on and off for 2 years, but the couple had broken up months before she had disappeared. He had always claimed that they had both moved on by January. She was dating a coworker and he was dating someone else. He had even met her new boyfriend, and he thought he was a nice guy. The two were still friends, and he had always claimed that there was no animosity towards Hay. Hay's diaries appear to echo the same sentiments. They had seemed to be on good terms following the breakup. DNA evidence had been collected and tested, but the results were never brought up in the trial, nor had the results been revealed to Adnan's counsel. Hay had tissue under her fingernails, and it didn't belong to Adnan or Jay, but that had never been brought up during the trial. DNA found on her neck also didn't belong to Adnan. A palm print had been found on Hayes' car that did belong to him, but that wasn't unusual as Adnan had been in and out of Hayes' car numerous times. But that palm print had been presented at court. The Serial podcast began covering Hayes' murder in 2014, focusing primarily on the person convicted, Adnan Syed. The podcast host, Sarah Koenig, had spent over a year studying the case and interviewing Adnan. Sarah had brought the case to the Innocence Project, who jumped in to take a deeper look at the evidence used to convict. It was the Innocence Project that was able to bring to light that the DNA evidence found on Hayes' body had never matched Adnan. On September 15, 2022, the Baltimore District Attorney brought forward a motion to vacate Adnan's conviction, citing Brady violations for prosecutors who originally worked on the case. A Brady violation is when the prosecution is determined to have purposely withheld evidence from the other side, meaning Adnan's legal team didn't get all of the evidence and therefore weren't able to effectively defend him. With Adnan's conviction being vacated, the courts basically said that his conviction didn't meet the legal threshold to uphold that conviction. Even if he had pleaded guilty, it still would have been dismissed. Adnan was released the day his conviction was vacated, and Baltimore City Police have stated that a suspect who had been previously known to the original investigation is now being looked into, but they are not announcing who that is at this time. Let me know if you want me to keep an eye on this case. While we still don't know exactly who killed Hae-Min Lee, had Serial not covered this case, we would never have known many details about this conviction that were so wrong. Everyone is entitled to a fair trial. Number 1. Joy Hibbs.
A mother of 2, happily married, Joy Hibbs was described as kind, gentle, and someone who loved her family immensely. She was the perfect mother and wife. Her 12-year-old son came home that day on April 19th of 1991 from elementary school about 1:05 p.m. to find smoke coming from his home at 1200 Spencer Drive in Croydon in Bristol Township. He tried to get into the house through the kitchen, but he couldn't because of the fire and the smoke. He ran to the neighbors for help, knowing that his mother was at home.
On April 19, 1991, it had been a normal day for the Hibbs family. 12-year-old David Hibbs was released early from school and was walking home. As he approached his home in Croydon, Pennsylvania, he immediately knew something was wrong. The windows were unusually dark, and as he got closer, he could see black smoke pouring from a kitchen vent. He opened the back door and was met with a wall of flames. His mother, 36-year-old Joy Hibbs, had been in the home, and he frantically searched for help, but it was too late. But when Joy's body was found in the rubble of the home, her cause of death hadn't been smoke inhalation, but rather multiple stab wounds, ligature marks around her neck, and fractured ribs. Joy Hibbs had been murdered. Her body had been found in her son's bedroom. The fire marshal noted that accelerant had been used in each of the bedrooms and likely had been set shortly before David's discovery. As school didn't normally end at noon, the killer likely thought they had more time, and the fire would fully engulf the home before it was discovered by neighbors. No one could understand why the suburban mother of 2 had been targeted in such a horrific attack. However, Joy's daughter revealed that someone had slashed her tires days before her murder, and Joy's co-workers stated that a man had called her at work several times threatening her. Several people were interviewed, including Joy's husband, but all were released. Earlier that morning, Joy had gone to the bank, cashed her paycheck, and she'd gone grocery shopping, which was a part of her normal Friday routine, and she was later seen that morning walking the new family puppy Major. Her wallet was found wedged between the couch cushions empty, and the contents of her purse had been found strewn around the kitchen. For 31 years, the Hibbs family were left with questions unanswered. In January 2022, the case was transferred to the Bucks County Sheriff's Office to be reinvestigated. Previous witnesses were re-interviewed, and in doing so they received new testimony from a witness who'd been withholding key information. April Atkins was married to Robert Atkins back in the 90s, but the couple had since divorced, and she felt that she needed to do the right thing now. They lived 2 doors down from the Hibbs, and she testified that on April 19, 1991, Robert had come home that afternoon covered in blood. He had told her that he had stabbed someone and demanded that she gather up the children because they were going to the Poconos for the weekend. She said at the time Atkins had been a low-level drug dealer. He was also working with law enforcement as an informant. He had several arrests related to drug possession, but he'd never been charged. She said that their alibi had been checked by police investigating at the time, and though Robert had been a suspect, he was released. She said that she never came forward out of fear of her ex-husband, and when they divorced, she couldn't come forward because he had custody of their youngest child, and she feared for their safety. Now that all her children were adults, she felt it was safe to come forward. Robert had a second woman provide him with an alibi for the time Joy had been murdered. He had made her sign a paper stating that she'd been on the phone with him, but when law enforcement went to speak with her, she had stated that it had been a lie. Through April Atkins, they attempted to get a confession from Robert. They had April call him and tell him that detectives had come to her home and interviewed her about their alibis. Robert told her during that call that she needed to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights and not say anything to them. He even said, "The phone is probably being tapped right now." Law enforcement arrested Robert Atkins on May 25, 2022, and he had his first court date on September 21, 2022, where he was charged with first-degree murder, second-degree murder, arson, and robbery. Robert Atkins has pleaded not guilty. This case appears to be going to trial. However, further court dates have not been set yet. Atkins, if convicted, faces life in prison or the death penalty. Number 2. Ann Pham. It was on January 21, 1982 in Seaside, California, when 5-year-old Ann Pham convinced her mother to allow her to walk to her afternoon kindergarten class alone. The youngest of 10 siblings, little Ann wanted to be like her siblings and not have her mother walk with her. The school was only 3 blocks away. With great hesitation, Ann's mother let her walk to school and watched from the window as Ann strode off. It should have only taken her a few minutes to get to school, but after Ann rounded the corner, something happened and she never made it to school. A massive search for the child was undertaken, and 2 days later, the body was found 2 miles away. She'd been strangled and assaulted. During the murder investigation, detectives at the time had little to go on. No one had seen Ann walking or getting abducted, there were no suspects, and quickly the leads dried up. The case went cold and sat for 4 decades untouched. In 2020, the Montgomery County District Attorney opened a new cold case unit, and Ann's case was reopened. Detectives submitted all evidence for new advanced DNA testing, and they discovered a hair sample in Ann's clothing. In 2022, they had enough DNA to submit to the national database, and immediately got a hit from a previously convicted man currently in Washoe County Jail in Nevada on a parole violation. Robert Leno had previously served a 20-year sentence for lewdness with a minor and possession of inappropriate imagery of minors. Now 70 years old, Leno had been 29 when Ann was kidnapped. He had lived nearby the Pham family and had never been a suspect in the initial investigation. Before his arrest in 1998, he had been stationed at Fort Ord, a now closed Army base. Ann's body had been found in a wooded area near that base. He is currently awaiting extradition to California. He was charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances. He faces life in prison or potentially the death penalty. Ann's family hasn't made any statements to the media, but they are said to be processing this new information as they never believed they would have answers to Ann's murder. Number 3. Claire Gravel. It was a warm summer evening on June 29, 1986 in Salem, Massachusetts. Claire Gravel was celebrating with her softball team at Maglicia's pub. The 20-year-old student was studying computer science at Salem State College. After a few drinks with friends, one of her friends dropped her off at her apartment around 1:30 a.m. After that, little is known about what happened to Claire. The following afternoon, a body was found in Beverly, Massachusetts, only a few miles from Salem. It was a young woman that had been severely beaten and strangled to death. The young woman was later identified as Claire. Law enforcement had little to work with. No one knew of anyone who had wanted to harm Claire. The friend that had dropped her off stated that they didn't see Claire go into her apartment as it was too dark, and stated that she might have been kidnapped on her way in. No one knew of her dating anyone or having any issues with a stalker. None of her neighbors heard anything suspicious or remembered seeing anything out of the ordinary, but many were asleep by that time. Eventually the case went cold, where it stayed for nearly 4 decades. In 2012, Claire's case was reopened by cold case detectives, and evidence from the initial investigation were retested for DNA. In 2022, the results of that retesting were made public when an Essex County grand jury indicted 62-year-old John Carey. Carey was already incarcerated at MCI Concord on a 2008 conviction for attempted murder. In 2007, Carey went over to a neighbor's house where Rosemary Diskin was home. Carey stated that he was meeting her husband for a drink, but when she revealed he wasn't home, Carey attacked her. He had brought a tie with him and attempted to strangle her with it. However, Carey didn't know that her 12-year-old son was home at the time, and he attacked Carey with a knife from the kitchen and stabbed him in the back, allowing the two to get away and seek help. Rosemary was certain that had her son not intervened, Carey had intended to kill her. Carey later revealed to law enforcement that he found asphyxiation erotic and claimed that the encounter was consensual, a claim that Rosemary stated was a way to re-victimize her by having the people around her think that she was having an affair with her neighbor. During the investigation, law enforcement discovered Carey's computer, which was filled with images and video clips of women being strangled. Ultimately, a jury found Carey guilty of attempted murder and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Carey had been due for early release on good behavior. Rosemary had recently been alerted to his release and was grateful that this new indictment had prevented him from being let out of prison, as she had been scared that he would come after her again if he got out. More will be released on what evidence the state has against Carey in regard to the murder of Claire Gravel, and it will be revealed in further court proceedings. At this time, there are no updates on when his next day in court will be. Claire Gravel's family, her father and siblings, said in a statement to the media that they are relieved and very, very grateful that a suspect has been identified after so many years. Number 4. Latrell Lindsay and Winifred Douglas.
Well, after more than 40 years, a Fairfield man has been arrested in connection to at least 2 murders. Detectives say DNA evidence led them to 76-year-old James Gary. The first case happened in July of 1980. A woman was found strangled to death in Union City. Investigators determined she had also been sexually assaulted. DNA was found, but no matches were found. The second case, in March of 1996, a woman was found dead along Highway 780 in Vallejo. Investigators determined that she was strangled and had blunt force trauma to her head and neck. At the time, no suspects were identified, but in 2021, during a sex crime investigation in the North Bay, a DNA sample was found that matched the first 2 crimes. Detectives identified a possible suspect. A DNA sample from Gary matched all 3 crimes. He was arrested this week and booked into the Solano County Jail.
In June 2022, an arrest was made closing 2 cold cases in California. 76-year-old James Ray Gary was identified in a sexual assault case in 2021. Evidence from that case had been submitted to the state's database and hit matches on 2 cold cases. The first was from the 1980 murder of Latrell Lindsay. Her body was found in her Union City home, and the main electrical line to the home had been cut, which is believed to be how the attacker gained entry. Latrell had been strangled to death, suffered blunt force trauma, and been sexually assaulted. The second victim's body was discovered in 1996. The remains were identified as 46-year-old Winifred Douglas. Winifred was from the Oakland area. Her body was found along Highway 780 in Vallejo, California. Her cause of death was determined to be strangulation and blunt force trauma. The cases were connected in 2012 when new DNA evidence was found on Winifred's clothing. Ultimately, little is known about the two women whose lives were cut short, nor the circumstances of the 2021 attack. However, more information may be revealed down the line in further court proceedings. James Ray Gary was arrested at his home without incident. He was booked into the Solano County Jail on 2 charges of homicide. He's being held without bail while awaiting further court dates. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing an update on Melissa Highsmith. Let's get into it. We previously covered this case back in September when there was a first potential sighting, but now it's been confirmed that the sighting was correct. The missing toddler who was abducted in 1971 has been found and reunited with her family. Let's go back and review what happened. It was in Fort Worth, Texas in 1971 when Alta Highsmith placed an ad in the paper for a babysitter. A woman answered the ad who called herself Ruth Johnson and stated that she would love to look after Alta's 1-year-old toddler, Melissa. The family arranged to meet at Alta's job, but the woman didn't show up. Johnson later called the next day, claiming that she had been in a car accident on the way and apologized for missing their appointment. She stated that she looked after other children, had a large home with a backyard, and really wanted the job. Alta agreed to hire the woman and made arrangements for her to pick up Melissa the next morning. Alta had to go to work early, so she left Melissa with her roommate to arrange the pickup. Johnson came to the apartment on August 23rd around 7:30 a.m. and showed up nicely dressed, and Alta's roommate gave her Melissa. When Alta returned home from work and waited for Ruth Johnson to bring back her child, she waited a few hours but then called police around 8 p.m. Law enforcement determined that the woman had likely used a fake name, and unfortunately, there had been little to go on. The roommate provided a description of the woman and a sketch was drawn up. She stated that the woman had been wearing an odd outfit for the hot Texas August. She'd been wearing all white with long gloves and a scarf over her head and around her neck. She said the outfit looked vaguely like an old nurse's uniform. It has long since been believed that the child had been abducted in order to raise the child with a different family, perhaps in an illegal adoption scheme. The case was reopened in 2005 at the request of Melissa's sister, who has since been spearheading Melissa's cold case along with her other siblings. Melissa is now 53 years old, and in September 2022, a tip came through to the National Centers for Missing Women and Children saying that the missing woman may be living in Charleston, but we now know more information about how that identification was made. Melissa's father, Jeffrey Highsmith, uploaded his DNA to 23andMe in hopes of finding his lost daughter and was thrilled when he connected with what he discovered was a grandchild. That grandchild assisted him in finding Melissa. Melissa had been raised by the name Melanie, and once found, DNA tests confirmed that she was Melissa Highsmith after being missing for over 5 decades. Melissa had grown up only 20 minutes from her birth family. The family reunited on Thanksgiving. Melissa's parents and her siblings, along with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a reunion no one ever thought would be possible.
Melissa then agreed to take a DNA test. And on Thanksgiving, she met her brother and then later her parents.
I feel that was the best day that I ever had in my whole life when I saw Melissa again.
And meeting her for the first time, it was hard to put into words. It was just a dream come true.
And now has sisters in her life.
I'm thankful to have her back. Welcome back, Sissy. Welcome to the family.
I'm just really happy.
This father got an embrace he thought would never happen. You look like all my other kids.
Video shows Jeffrey Highsmith the moment he says he was reunited with his daughter.
It is overwhelming, but at the same time, it's just the most wonderful feeling in the world. My father texted me on Messenger, and he told me, you know, I've been looking for my daughter for 51 years.
This whole time, Melissa didn't know her birth family was trying to find her.
The person that raised me, I asked her, is there anything that you need to tell me? And it was confirmed that she knew that I was baby Melissa. So that just made it real.
And they said, Dad, she's alive. And I started crying. And after 51 years, it's so emotional.
Melissa believes that the woman who abducted her was who raised her. The woman is still alive, but Melissa does not want her to go to prison. When confronted, the woman admitted to knowing that Melissa had been kidnapped as a baby. This made Melissa's childhood make more sense. She said that she never felt loved by the woman she thought was her mother. She went on to reveal she had a rough childhood, experiencing many different types of abuse growing up. She ran away from home at 15, got married to her high school boyfriend, and ended up in a vicious cycle of substance abuse and poverty.
And it was just really an abusive until I ran away from home when I was 15.
And then where did you go?
I went to the streets. I did what I had to do to get by.
What does that mean?
It means I worked the streets.
Melissa had 3 children by the time she was 19, but they all got removed from her care and put up for adoption. She was married 3 times, and all 3 marriages ended due to substance abuse issues. Melissa is now happily married and wants to redo her marriage ceremony so her father can walk her down the aisle. Her family had never stopped looking for her, and it was their commitment to continue searching, even when there was little hope, that allowed them to find and have the opportunity to connect with Melissa after so many years. In a statement on social media, they said, "Our finding Melissa was purely because of DNA, not because of any police, FBI involvement, podcast involvement, or even our family's own private investigators or speculations." The Fort Worth Police Department is committed to completing this investigation to uncover all of the available information concerning Melissa's abduction that occurred 51 years ago. Melissa stated that she would like to change her name to her birth name and looks forward to getting to know her 4 siblings and her parents. Number 1. Lady of the Dunes. On July 26, 1974, a 12-year-old girl was walking her dog in the Cape Cod Dunes in Provincetown, Massachusetts, when she came across a naked woman she thought was sunbathing. The woman was lying face down on a beach blanket, but when she got closer, she made a realization that made her blood run cold, and she bolted. The police were called, and they confirmed that the woman was deceased. The woman was missing her hands. Her nearly decapitated head was resting on a pair of folded jeans and a blue bandana. It was determined that she had likely been there for 2 weeks before the discovery of her body, which already gave law enforcement a disadvantage in identifying her. She would be called Lady of the Dunes and become Massachusetts' longest unidentified homicide victim. She was described as a redhead with an athletic build and medium height. Her hair had been pulled back into a ponytail, and her toes were painted with pink nail polish. The thing that had led to the biggest hope of someone recognizing her was that the Jane Doe had extensive dental work with multiple gold crowns, which was estimated to have cost upwards of $5,000 at the time. It was also estimated that she was in her 30s. At the time of her discovery, there was very little for police to go on. There were 2 sets of footprints that led to her body. Her cause of death was determined to be severe blunt force trauma to the skull, and her autopsy revealed that she'd been sexually assaulted, likely post-mortem. In addition to her hands being removed, she was also missing a forearm. Detectives canvassed nearby motels, rooming houses, and thousands of missing women reports, but nothing matched. They even had a clay model reconstruction of the woman. However, despite best efforts, there could be little uncovered about the woman, and the case would ultimately go cold for many decades. Over the years, there had been many theories locally about who this mystery woman was. One of these theories was that she had worked as an extra for the movie Jaws, which had been filmed earlier that year in Martha's Vineyard, but that had never been confirmed. Several other people had come forward throughout the years, thinking that she was their missing sibling or someone they knew, but each time the identification was ruled out. Throughout the years, they exhumed her body more than once to re-examine her remains and look for new clues. Her skull was removed in order to create a new artistic rendering of what she might have looked like. In 2000, a DNA sample was collected and stored, and in 2022, the DNA was sent to Ortham Labs, world-renowned for using genetic genealogy to identify unknown individuals. On October 31, 2022, the Massachusetts State Police, with the FBI, announced that the Lady of the Dunes had been identified as Ruth Marie Terry after nearly 50 years after her body was discovered. She had been 37 years old at the time of her death.
We are standing here today to announce that after nearly a half-century of investigative efforts, we have identified the oldest unidentified homicide victim in Massachusetts, known as the Lady of the Dunes. She is Ruth Marie Terry from Tennessee, who was just 37 years old at the time of her death. The FBI identified Ruth using investigative genealogy. This is a unique method that can generate new leads for unsolved homicides, as well as help identify unknown victims. This is, without a doubt, a major break in the investigation that will, hopefully, bring all of us closer to identifying the killer.
Today, over 48 years after her murder and discovery, we can finally say her name, Ruth Marie Terry. We know Ruth had family and friends who loved her, and we are aware that this development has not been an easy one for them, so we keep them in our thoughts today during this difficult time. Certainly, during the years that they were in contact with her, they never envisioned the outcome for the child, the teenage girl, the young woman they knew, loved, and cared about. We hope today's announcement helps shed some light on the many questions they have had these many years and marks another step towards answering more of them. For many police investigators at the end of their careers, there is often an unresolved case that haunts them, that intrudes upon the days, years, and decades of the rest of their lives. This case has been that for generations of Provincetown police officers and Massachusetts state troopers.
The highest calling in this job is to give voice to the voiceless and to serve victims and their families. And it may take months, it may take years. This case, it's taken over 4 decades, but no one's stopping. And this is a very important development, but we're on to the next round. As Joe and Colonel Mason went over, we need help from the public. We welcome more information. We're determined to solve this crime.
If Ruth Marie hadn't met her assailant in 1974, she could be 86 years old today. If the person responsible for the crime was in his or her 20s or 30s, he would be in his late 60s or 70s. If he was a little older, he may well be dead, but we will assume he is not. And we will pursue every lead and every clue to bring this person to justice.
Ruth was born on September 8, 1936, in a small mining town in Tennessee. By the time she was 20, she had left home and was married for the first time. By 1957, she was divorced and working in a car manufacturing plant in Michigan. She got pregnant and had a child, but she gave the child up for adoption to a family that worked at the plant. Then she left Michigan shortly after that. The child, Richard Hanchett, put his DNA into Ancestry.com in 2018 in the hopes of finding family related to his mother. He was able to connect with some family, but also discovered that his mother had been missing since the 1970s. This was the connection that was used to identify Ruth. Sometime in 1974, Ruth went to visit family in Tennessee with a new husband, Guy Rockwell Moldavin. After this visit, Ruth's family never heard from her again. Ruth's sister-in-law, Carol Terry, is quoted as saying, "I always had a bad feeling about that guy that she had married." They'd only been married for 6 months before her body was discovered. Once she had gone missing, Moldovan disappeared, never reporting his new bride missing. Ruth had been known to use several different variations of her name. Law enforcement say that she had connections to Tennessee, Michigan, and California, and they are looking for more information about her life before and up to 1974. Authorities announced shortly after Ruth was identified that they were also looking for any information about Guy Moldovan. He also used several names, was known to travel around the U.S., and was the lead suspect in the murder of his second wife and stepdaughter in 1960 in Seattle, Washington. It is strongly believed that he is responsible for Ruth's murder, the murders in Seattle, and an additional murder of an unknown victim. After he fled Washington, human remains were discovered in the septic tank of his home. He is also the lead suspect in 2 murders in June of 1950 in Humboldt, California. 28-year-old Henry Baird was murdered, and 17-year-old Barbara Jo Kelly was dating Moldovan when she disappeared and her body was never discovered. Guy Rockwell Moldovan died at the age of 78 in 2002 in Salinas, California. Law enforcement are still working to positively identify Moldovan as the killer, though they are open to looking at other individuals. Number 2. The Bear Brook victims. On November 10, 1985, a group of hunters discovered 2 bodies in a metal drum at the Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire. Determined to be an adult female between the ages of 23 and 33 with dark curly hair and extensive dental work, and a little girl between the ages of 5 and 11 with a gap between her teeth and dark hair. The initial investigation followed every lead and ruled out several possible identities. 15 years later, in 2000, 2 more bodies were found in the same area in a similar metal drum. Authorities say that it was missed because it was likely outside the initial investigation search perimeter. The other 2 bodies were also discovered to be female, aged 2 and 4 with dark hair and an overbite, and a girl between the ages of 1 to 3 with light hair and a gap in her front teeth. The Allenstown Police Department could not identify the victims, and they would eventually be called the Bear Brook Murders or the Allenstown 4. In 2013 and 2015, different sets of composites of what the victims might have looked like were released in hopes of identifying them. In 2014, through DNA, they were able to determine that the woman and the oldest and the youngest child were related. The woman was the mother of the 2 children, and the 4th victim was not related to the others. In 2017, it was announced that all the bodies had been connected to serial killer Terry Petter Rasmussen. He was the biological father of the 4th unknown girl, aged 2 to 4. Unfortunately, Rasmussen died in prison in 2010 of lung cancer and could not be asked about these murders. He had been serving a life sentence for the murder of Yoonsun Jun. In 2019, authorities announced that they had identified the 3 related victims as Marilise Elizabeth Honeychurch, born in 1954, her daughters Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, born in 1971, and Sarah Lynn McWaters, born in 1977. They made the discovery with the help of a librarian, Rebecca Heath, who was researching the case and had come across posts on Ancestry.com looking for a long-lost half-sister named Sarah. The post dated back to as early as 1999. It wasn't until she got in touch with the family and asked if they were still looking for Sarah and if they had more information.
She was born in 1977, was born in California, and this individual was looking for her and her mother. And the more I start looking into Sarah McWaters, I find that there are family members that are looking for Sarah's mother, Marlise, and that Marlise had another daughter, Marie.
That's when the family said that all they knew was that she was last seen with her mother, sister, and a man named Rasmussen. Rebecca Heath then contacted Peter Headley, a deputy for the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, who worked with genealogists to help identify Rasmussen. With this new information, they could use DNA to positively identify the victims. Marilise had been married twice, having a child with each husband, Mary Lise and her daughters were last seen on Thanksgiving in 1978 when she fought with her mother over a man that she had brought with her, and his name was Terry Rasmussen. The only other assumed sighting of Mary Lise was 2 signed arrest reports for Robert Evans, a known alias of Rasmussen, signed by his wife, Elizabeth Evans, in February and June of 1980. There had been no mention of the kids in the police report, and they have not found any other relation to the unknown 4th victim other than she was the daughter of Terry Rasmussen. After identifying the 3 victims, officials ruled that Rasmussen had killed all 4. They are still looking for any information on identifying the last victim, Rasmussen's daughter, and there was a new composite made in 2019 of what she might have looked like. The child was likely born around 1975 or 1976, possibly in California, Texas, or Arizona. Rasmussen is being investigated for several other murders. In 1980, 14-year-old Lauren Rand and 25-year-old Denise Denal went missing. Their bodies were never found. Both victims lived within a mile of Rasmussen's home at the time. A surviving daughter of Rasmussen also told law enforcement that she remembered having 2 siblings, but that they had died, and it is believed that Rasmussen may have murdered those children as well, or one of them may be the unidentified child. Law enforcement are still working to identifying her, and they've dubbed her the middle child and finding her maternal family. As well, they are looking to determine if Rasmussen had more victims in the areas he lived in, which include Colorado, California, Texas, Arizona, Idaho, Virginia, Ohio, Oregon, Hawaii, and New Hampshire. While in New Hampshire in 1980, a woman named Elizabeth Evans was listed as his spouse, but this woman has never been identified. Aliases he was known to have used include Robert Bob Evans, Curtis Mayo Kimball, Gordon Jensen, Larry Vanner, and Gary Mockerman. Number 3. Gacy victim number 5. The Cook County Sheriff's Office has made an announcement in regards to the remaining unknown victims of serial killer John Wayne Gacy. In October 2021, one of the victims was identified with the help of the DNA Doe Project. This victim was known as Gacy victim number 5. For those who may not know, Gacy was a prolific serial killer who tortured and killed at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978 in Chicago.
Terry, the horrible truth to suburban contractor John Gacy's rambling statements to police last week is becoming more and more evident with each passing day. 6 more bodies unearthed from the basement crawl space of Gacy's Norwood Park Township home today, bringing to 15 the number found there since Friday. Des Plaines and Cook County Sheriff's Police investigators arrived first thing this morning to resume their search. The big white wagon, which has been used to transport bodies from the northwest suburb to the morgue, Fishbein Institute, pulled up early today and stood waiting outside the house while more digging went on inside. Also on the scene, crowds of onlookers, the curious, many of whom have stood the death watch for days. By late today, just about all the hollow spaces in the house had been opened up for the searchers, floorboards and ceiling panels pried loose and carted out to the huge bin just outside the front door. Most of the attention has been centered on the 30-inch dirt crawl space, similar to one we photographed in a house near Gacy's. This is where 12 of the 13 bodies were buried. Searchers are being hindered by water, which keeps filling in their holes, a water problem which Gacy had used as an excuse to have trenches dug in the crawl space. Employees who did the actual digging said they thought drainage tiles were to be buried, not bodies.
Gacy had a total of 8 unidentified victims, and in 2011, the Cook County Sheriff's Office reopened the case in the hopes of identifying them. They partnered with the DNA Doe Project, an organization that uses DNA and genetic genealogy to identify Jane and John Does. Since 2011, they have identified 3 unidentified victims: Timothy McCoy, James Hackinson, and William Bundy. Now they have identified a 4th victim as Francis Wayne Alexander, who went by Wayne. Wayne would have been 21 or 22 at the time of his death. Originally from North Carolina, he had moved to Chicago after getting married in New York in 1975. However, the marriage only lasted 3 months and they divorced shortly after. The family never reported Wayne missing, as they had originally thought he wanted space after his divorce. The last known sighting of him was a traffic ticket that was issued on January 5, 1976 in Chicago. His remains were found in the crawl space of Gacy's home in 1978, and authorities believe he was killed between 1976 and 1977, most likely shortly after that traffic ticket, as according to records, he didn't make much income in 1976. Wayne is survived by his mother, 2 half-sisters, and 2 half-brothers. The family is also asking for their privacy at this time and does not wish to be identified, but they did prepare a statement to the media.
Our hearts are heavy. Our sympathies go to other victims' families. Our only comfort is knowing this killer no longer breathes the same air as we do.
Additionally, they have said that they were saddened by the news, but relieved to have answers and finally know what happened to him. Sheriff Dart, an investigator in this case, also said, quote, "This is the first time that we actually had a parent that was still alive in one of these cases." The Cook County Sheriff's Office is now looking towards identifying the remaining victims, known only as victim number 10, victim number 13, victim number 21, 27, and 28. All young males that would have gone missing from 1975 to 1977. Gacy was known to have abducted his victims from particular areas of Chicago, but he also lured some by promising them work or posing as a police officer, whatever it took to get them into his home. He was criminally active until his arrest in 1978. If you'd like me to cover Gacy more in depth, let me know down below in the comment section. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing how DNA connected and solved 4 different cold cases in Denver from a spree serial killer active in the late 70s to the early 80s. Let's get into it. On December 7, 1978, in Denver, Colorado, Antonio Livaudez arrived home from work at 6 p.m. He instantly knew something was wrong. His 9-month-old daughter was in the swing on a back porch alone, and his 3-year-old was watching TV in the dark. Antonio immediately went upstairs and looked in his bedroom and found his wife, 33-year-old Madeline Foray Livaudez, in a pool of blood. Madeline and Antonio married in Philadelphia, where Madeline had worked for a children's nature magazine called Ranger Rick, and research for the magazine let her travel the world. She had her 2 daughters in Philadelphia and wrote a children's science book. The family had recently moved to Denver, Colorado, where Antonio got a job at an architectural office. At the crime scene, it was discovered that Madeline had been stabbed several times, and there were other details of the case being withheld, but law enforcement confirmed that there were sexual elements in addition to the stabbing. There was no sign of forced entry, so it is believed that her attacker had knocked on the door, then forced their way into the home and made her go to the bedroom. There, the assailant stabbed her. The 2 children were not harmed in the attack. Authorities had no leads and said that at the time that Madeline had been killed, authorities had been hampered by several unsolved murders, and resources had been stretched thin. They did state that Madeline's murder was unrelated to all their other cases. Several samples of forensic evidence were taken and stored, but as it was 1978, there was not much they could do with DNA evidence. 2 years later, on Sunday, August 10, 1980, Denver police responded to a call on the 500 block of East 17th Street to a report of a woman lying in the road. Responding officers discovered 53-year-old Dolores Barajas, who suffered multiple stab wounds. Dolores died at the scene before medical help arrived. Dolores had been walking on her way to work at the Fairmont Hotel. She had recently moved to Denver for the summer to visit family. Originally from El Paso, Texas, that day was supposed to be her last shift of work before moving back to Texas. She was a mother, a grandmother, and very much loved by her family. The senseless attack had left law enforcement baffled, and for many years there had been no connection to Madeline's murder case. Later that year, another woman was found on December 24, 1980. She could not be identified at the time, but was later identified as 27-year-old Gwendolyn Harris. Gwendolyn's body was found with multiple stab wounds. Money was still on her body, eliminating robbery as motive. Gwen had last been seen at the Polo Club Lounge on December 20th, 4 days before her body had been found. Again, little headway was made in solving her murder. Forensic evidence was collected and stored, and because it had been so different from Madeline and Dolores' murder, the 3 cases were not connected. Then, on January 24, 1981, a teenager named Antoinette Parks was found dead in a field next to 64th Avenue and Broadway in Denver. Annette was stabbed 23 times. She had been a 17-year-old high school student. She loved children and hoped to work with kids someday. Antoinette was just over 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. Her family said that she'd been very excited to be a mother herself. After exhausting all leads and evidence from these cases, all 4 cases would go cold. The circumstances of the cases had all been different. Madeline had been murdered in her home, when a man presumably walked up to her door, barged in during broad daylight and attacked her while her children were also in the home. Dolores had been attacked in the street in the early morning hours. Gwen had been abducted on her way home in the very early morning hours, and Antoinette, a teenager, was abducted on her way home from school and dumped in a field. In 2004, Denver police started a dedicated cold case crime unit. They began to look at the cases of all 4 women. In 2013, they got their first connection. DNA evidence collected Dolores and Madeline to the same killer. 2 years later, in 2015, authorities could also connect Harris to that killer. And finally, in 2018, Parks was added to the list of victims of the same assailant. In 2014, the Denver Police Department used genealogy DNA services to locate relatives of the killer in Texas. After working with Texas departments in 2021, they came up with a suspect, Joseph Michael Irvin. Additionally, they also discovered that he was wanted on a murder charge in Texas and had an extensive criminal history. In 1969, Irvin, who was 17 at the time, was at a local bowling alley when he and an unidentified friend walked up to a car of 21-year-old Rodney Bonham. Irvin asked Rodney and his passenger a question. The confrontation turned hostile, and Irvin pulled a gun and shot Rodney in the neck. Irvin then asked the passenger if they could drive. The passenger then managed to close the door and run to the bowling alley to call for help. After 4 days in the hospital, Rodney Bonham died from the gunshot. Irvin is said to have called the family after Rodney had died, saying, quote, "I'm sorry he's dead, but we all have to go sometime. I'm sorry I shot him," end quote. It is then believed that he had fled to Colorado. According to criminal records in Colorado, he had been arrested in 1970 for a slew of burglaries and sexual assaults, including the sexual assault of a 10-year-old girl. He was acquitted by reason of insanity and was sent to a mental hospital in Pueblo, Colorado, but was released on a conditional bail in 1977. Then, on June 27, 1981, Aurora PD officer 26-year-old Deborah Sue Corr pulled over a man that she believed was intoxicated. She radioed in her location, the man's name, and license plate number, asking for help in the arrest. She was in the process of arresting the man when he managed to break free. There was a scuffle, and in the struggle, the man managed to get a hold of Deborah's service weapon. At this time, a local man named Glenn Spies was driving by and stopped to help. The suspect shot Deborah in the head and Glenn in the back before fleeing the scene. When police arrived, Deborah was declared deceased. Deborah had just completed her first year as an officer and was married to a fellow officer. This would be Aurora PD's first line of duty shooting and forever change the department's patrolling alone policy. Glenn was also rushed to the hospital where he was able to recover from his wounds. Unfortunately, the bullet exploded near his spine, and it would cost him the ability to join the police force as he walked with a limp and lived in constant pain. In July 1981, the Aurora City Council awarded him $10,000 for his heroism and sacrifice. Police found the temporary driver's license of the man that Deborah had pulled over in her patrol vehicle and identified him as Joe Irwing. They went to his address and found Joe there trying to get off his handcuffs by sawing his wrist. Joe Irving was arrested. 5 days later, on July 1st, 1981, Joe Irving, who at the time was 30 years old, hung himself while in solitary cell in Adams County Jail. He left a suicide note which said, quote, "To the Denver community, I pray that I will be forgiven for taking up your time and for my sickening behavior. To the kid in the hospital and Miss Core, I didn't mean what I did. I was so uptight. Forgive me." And it was signed Joe Irving. After his arrest, police discovered that he was currently out on bail for sexual assault from 1980. After the suicide, police also discovered that there had been a mistake during his bail hearing. When putting his name into the computer database, authorities had put his birth year as 1952 when he was born in 1951. When police put the correct information into the database, Joe Irving came up as an alias. His real name was Joseph Michael Everin, and he was wanted in connection to a murder in Texas, and finally connecting him to the 4 unsolved cold cases in Denver and the murdered police officer in Aurora. After exhausting all efforts to find a catalog piece of DNA from Irvin, Denver and Texas authorities petitioned the court to exhume his body and get a DNA sample. The courts approved the exhumation of Irving in 2022, and shortly after, the Denver Police Department officially announced that Irvin was a serial killer connected to the killings of these 4 women in Denver. After 40 years, the families and the Denver community have answers to these cold cases. Some of the family members had these statements to say after finding out.
Well, I'd like to say this has taken a long time. We can finally have peace knowing who did this to my little sister. Me and my brother are the only remaining siblings of 6 children. I wore a shirt today in memory of all my siblings. And I lost these 2 sisters. They were the oldest. One in 2018 to a car wreck on First and Knox here in Denver. The second one died from heartbreak from the car wreck. Of course, you guys know my little sister Antoinette died in '81, and my little sister Rhonda, who was her, she passed last year, September 9th, to cancer. So with that being said, I'd like you guys to know we have closure. We're thankful for the hard work, determination of everybody involved here. I wish my sisters and my mom could all be here to see this. Fortunately, they didn't live long enough to see this, but I know they're here with us in spirit, and I want to say thank you guys for all coming to take the time to listen to us.
Hello, my name is Carl, and like my brother said, it's been a long time coming, and now we can actually, really rest better at night. Like I said, the rest of them, they're not here. Like I said, if my mom or my sisters were here, but I know they are, because they're sitting high and looking low. And they're saying right now, hey, thank you guys, every last one of you, for everything. Anybody had anything to do with this, believe me, they're saying thank you, and God bless you all.
Good morning. My sister Ariel and I wanted to take time today to express our gratitude to the Denver Police Department and all agencies and individuals involved over the years for all of the hard work and the sacrifice in solving this series of horrific crimes. We are here to talk about our mother, Madeline Fury Livaday. She was a young woman with a very bright future. She was a writer. She had written for Nature magazines for years and had written and published a book. She was an ecologist with a passion for the natural world and the environment. She was a loving wife, sister, daughter, and mother to 2 very young girls. But in 1978, she had that bright future ripped away from her. Tragically, we didn't get to grow up with her and to hear her stories and to witness the contributions that she could have made to the world. It's been a lot of information to absorb so suddenly after all this time. We found out that this man murdered 4 more women, and he assaulted an uncounted number of others. In addition, to learn about the line of duty death of Officer Deborah Sue Kaur has been personally very impactful. She was out doing her job when she attempted to arrest this serial killer for an unrelated crime. And in the course of his arrest, she was murdered herself. But with her sacrifice, she prevented him from killing anyone else. And it's clear that he wasn't going to stop on his own. She stopped him. The police stopped him back in 1981. And for that, for Officer Kaur's sacrifice of her life, we are thankful. Finally, I would like to reflect on how the Denver Police Department has proven today that it won't stop hunting for the predators among us. For us citizens who are, like my mother was, just home feeding our children breakfast, or walking to the bus stop, or home from school. For us, the DPD Cold Case Unit and the Denver Crime Lab and the Denver DA's office have said, you're not going to get away with it. We're going to find you. And for that, we are here today to say thank you. It is a great relief to our family to finally have this resolution and to know that they never stopped working towards that goal for us. Thank you.
Evelyn's sisters are all out of town and asked me to extend this statement on their behalf. So on behalf of Eileen Fury Roy, Tess Fury, and Megan Fury Kinney, Madeline had a vibrant and curious spirit. She was fearlessly adventurous and loved traveling as part of her job as an editor of the children's magazine, Ranger Rick. She loved learning. Every elementary school report card had a notation saying something like, "Excellent student, but talks too much." Madeline was fun, and she delighted in her daughters Molly and baby Ariel. She was a romantic who loved her life, but when her daughters were born, she was over the moon. One sweet memory we have is that she used to sing to her girls the song Stevie Wonder wrote when his daughter was born, "Isn't She Lovely?" She could never have imagined leaving them. It is an unmitigated tragedy that they never got to know their creative and talented mother. Madeline was loved and admired by her family and all who knew her. We will never stop missing her.
Denver PD are currently going through old cold cases and looking for additional victims of sexual assault or murder, and believe Irvin had more victims that are currently unknown. While it is bittersweet to not have justice in this case, hopefully the victims and their families can rest easier knowing that this predator isn't here anymore to hurt anyone else. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 4 more solved cold cases. But with that being said, let's get into it. Number 1, Nancy Elaine Anderson. On January 7th, 1972, 19-year-old Nancy Anderson was in her apartment getting a demonstration from 2 silverware salesmen when her roommate came home around 2:30 p.m. Her roommate, 18-year-old Jody Spooner, joined as the men finished, with neither woman buying any silverware. Jody then went to her room to have a nap. Jody woke up around 5 p.m. She went to the kitchen when she noticed that water was running in Nancy's bathroom, which she thought was odd, as she thought Nancy would have left for work by that time. She discovered Nancy's bedroom door ajar and found Nancy on the bedroom floor bloody. Jody immediately went to a neighbor's apartment and said they needed to call 911 because Nancy had killed herself. Their apartment was in Waikiki, Hawaii, and Nancy had just moved there in October 1971 to have some time before she started college. She was a 1970 John Glenn High School graduate in Bay City, Michigan. She had just returned from a trip home to visit family for Christmas and New Year. Nancy worked at a McDonald's and was known to be very friendly to anyone she met. When police arrived, they discovered that Nancy had multiple stab wounds on her neck, chest, stomach, back, and sides. She also had what looked like defensive wounds, which for police eliminated the chance that they were self-inflicted. Police collected evidence, including several bloody towels and multiple sets of fingerprints. Police interviewed Jody, who said that she'd heard something odd around 4:15 p.m., but hadn't thought much about it because there weren't any further disturbances after that. She also believed that all the doors had been locked, including Jody's bedroom. Police talked to several people in the surrounding area, but no one had heard or seen anything suspicious. Neighbors and acquaintances of Nancy said that she'd been known to be very friendly and often had men come over or to go out on several dates since moving to Hawaii. Police had found evidence that Nancy had opened a bank account at the Bank of Hawaii that day. When they talked to the teller who had assisted her, they said that she'd arrived sometime around 2:15 to 3 p.m., but believed it to be closer to 3 p.m. After the police walked back to the apartment, they put Nancy's time of death between 3:10 p.m. and 5:15 p.m. At first, the two salesmen were suspects. They were identified as Parker Graham and Jeffrey Alward, and they volunteered fingerprints and took polygraphs, eliminating them as suspects. Other friends, ex-boyfriends, and co-workers in both Nancy and Jody's life were interviewed, most giving fingerprints and taking polygraphs, eliminating them as suspects as well. During the autopsy, it was discovered that Nancy had been stabbed 60 times with a total of 63 wounds, 3 being exit wounds. The murder weapon was believed to be a knife, 10 millimeters wide and 6 millimeters long. After months of no leads, Nancy's case went cold. In 2001, a DNA profile was made of the blood samples found in 1972. 3 different DNA profiles were found, 2 male and 1 female. Between 2001 and 2004, all past suspects' DNA was tested and were all eliminated as possibilities again. Law enforcement in Honolulu also used DNA that they sent to Parabon Nanolabs, which specializes in DNA phenotyping, which is a type of processing of predicting physical appearances and ancestry from unidentified DNA evidence. They were able to produce a projected sketch of the suspect. In December of 2021, Hawaii cold case detectives got their first break in the case in almost 50 years. An anonymous tip came in that Tudor Chirila should be a suspect in the case. The suspect, now 77 years old, was a lawyer in Reno, Nevada, and had previously run for the Nevada Supreme Court. In 1972, Chirila had lived less than 3 miles from Nancy Anderson. At the time, he was working as a graduate assistant attorney. In 1995, Chirila was charged with kidnapping and assaulting a woman that he was in a relationship with. She alleged that he had severely beaten her, trying to render her unconscious to sexually assault her. She managed to escape and press charges, but the case was never convicted. The Hawaii Police Department in February 2022 requested the help of the Reno police in getting a sample of Chirila's DNA, but they were unsuccessful in getting the DNA covertly. So in March of 2022, they tried something different, and they enlisted Chirila's son and got DNA from him. The following month in April, he provided the sample, and his identity was confirmed. A warrant was issued on September 1st to collect DNA from Chirila himself. On September 6th, they finally got the sample. 2 days after law enforcement collected the sample, Tudor Chirila attempted suicide. However, he was found in time and sent to the hospital where he made a full recovery. On September 12th, it was confirmed that the DNA found at the scene was Chirila's. He was arrested and held in Reno, Nevada without bail. Hawaii authorities are working on extraditing him, and that hearing is set for early December. Number 2. George Clarence Seitz. It was in early March 2019 when NYPD detectives got a phone call from an anonymous tipster. The now adult said that when she was 11 years old, she saw her mother and stepfather burying black garbage bags in their backyard in 1976. The tipster believed that the garbage bags contained the body of a person and gave the exact location. On March 12, 2019, investigators began searching the property and human remains were discovered under a concrete slab in the backyard of a home on 1115th Street in Richmond Hill, Queens, New York. It was determined the body had been dismembered at the neck, shoulders, and hips. Over the next few years, the NYPD and the FBI worked to identify the man. Eventually, they would use DNA from the remains to attempt to identify him. Using genetic genealogy, in 2021, they were able to finally identify him, and in doing so, were one step closer to solving his murder. The man was identified as 81-year-old World War I vet George Clarence Seitz, who on December 10, 1976 had left his home in Jamaica, Queens to go get a haircut and was never heard from again. Once George Seitz was identified, police did extensive interviews and scoured records, trying to find as much evidence as they could to point to a suspect. And they found a suspect, and it was the owner of a barber shop that Seitz frequented. 74-year-old Martin Mata was identified and confessed. He was later charged with second-degree murder. Mata had stated that he had killed Seitz and robbed him for the $7,000 to $8,000 he had on him. Seitz was known to distrust banks from war times, and he was known to carry large sums of money on him at all times. Mata claimed that he stabbed Seitz in the head, dismembered his body, and buried it in the backyard. He was arrested without incident. In October 2022, he pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter after taking a plea agreement. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison.
Frankly, you're like Queens' own Jeffrey Dahmer Light. I hope they had hard, terrible years.
Instead of getting a haircut, he got robbed, killed, dismembered, and buried in the backyard where nobody would find him for 45 years.
My mother died never knowing what had happened to her brother. My hope is that each day you spend in prison, you will think of your evil actions, the suffering my uncle must have endured.
Melinda Katz, District Attorney for Queens, said in a press conference, quote, "After 46 years, a veteran of First World War gets justice. The successes of modern technology and forensics made it possible for us to not only identify the remains of the victim, but also to find any witnesses. When I became District Attorney, I created the cold case unit for cases such as this, where time seems to be the enemy. Time allowed forensic genetic genealogy and our investigators to catch up to this defendant." End quote. Number 3, Claire K. Holman. On March 24, 1994, a friend and neighbor came to deliver mail to her senior neighbor, Claire K. Holman, in Barajo Springs, San Diego, California. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer, which was odd. She peeked into one of the front windows and saw that the home inside was ransacked. Miss K. Holman was found deceased in her home. The 72-year-old widow and former hairdresser had owned a shop in town for many years, but was now retired. There were no signs of forced entry in her home, so investigators believe that she either knew her attacker or they were familiar with her routine. An autopsy showed that she had been strangled with a rope or cord, and her death was ruled a homicide. After months of investigation and no leads, her case went cold. In 2003, the San Diego County Sheriff's Department got a DNA profile from the evidence that was discovered at the scene. They entered the results into CODIS, the federal database of DNA for unsolved crimes, but they didn't get any matches from that. In March of 2021, they would try again, but this time with genetic genealogy in the hopes of finding a suspect. The evidence from the crime scene was re-examined and they found a single hair with foreign male DNA. With that, they were able to find 118 distant relatives of the suspect. For several months, they combed through and narrowed down all of the relatives until they honed in on a single suspect. In September 2022, it was announced that a suspect had been identified, Jerry Dwayne Robinson. Robinson had been a plumber in the area and may have worked for Claire Holman on occasion. Robinson died 15 years ago in 2007 from cancer. A paternity test was used to confirm the DNA from the suspect matched Robinson's. At the time of the killing, he was 51 years old. It is also believed the motive was robbery and sexual assault. Both the Holman and Robinson families have been informed, and the San Diego County Sheriff's Department considers the case closed. Number 4. Sandra DeFelice. It was the day after Christmas in 1980 when 25-year-old Sandra DeFelice was found in her Las Vegas home brutally beaten to death and sexually assaulted around 9:30 p.m. She was found in her bed under the covers. She lived at the house with a roommate and her 3-year-old daughter. Fortunately, the daughter was not at home at the time. She had been staying with her grandparents. Investigators collected a vast quantity of evidence, including foreign dark hairs, a glass with a fingerprint, and a sexual assault kit. The young mother was recently divorced and worked as a waitress to support herself and her daughter. Her ex-husband was initially the lead suspect, but was quickly cleared. Days of the investigation turned to months, which turned to years, and Sandra's case went cold. In December of 2021, the Las Vegas Cold Case Unit got a call from Sandra's daughter, now in her 40s, asking for any updates on her mother's case. This made cold case detectives re-examine the case with fresh eyes. They found fingernail scrapings under Sandra's sexual assault kit that could now be tested with new DNA technology available. They found male DNA in the sample. The sample pointed to a suspect, 64-year-old Paul Nuttall.
After Paul Nuttall was taken into custody, my cold case investigators had the pleasure of making the one phone call that every cold case detective wants to make, and that was to call the family member, specifically Sandra DeFelice's daughter, and it let her know that there had been a development in the case and that we had arrested the suspect who was responsible for the murder of Sandra DeFelice. I am hopeful that in some way, shape, or form this provides some sort of closure for the family and ultimately results in some type of closure and justice for Sandra.
Nuttall had been detained for questioning in the original investigation but had been released. Police went and spoke with Nuttall, showing him a picture of Sandra and asking if he remembered her. About her murder, he responded by saying he didn't know what they were talking about, and at that time they also got a DNA sample from Nuttall. He had been the initial suspect as his fingerprints had been found on the glass received from Sandra's house. Sandra's roommate was a friend of Nuttall at the time, and she explained that she had given Nuttall the drink when he had asked for a place to stay for the night as he had nowhere else to go, but she had told him no because Sandra was sleeping and she didn't know him well. The roommate claimed that she escorted him out of the house before leaving as well. The roommate is now deceased. Nuttall would have been 21 years old at the time. The DNA was a confirmed match for Nuttall, and he was arrested. He is being held without bail and is currently waiting for his next court appearance. They believe sexual assault and robbery was the motive. Homicide Lieutenant Jason Johnson said in a statement to the media, quote, "After he was taken into custody, my cold case investigators had the pleasure of making the one phone call that every cold case detective wants to make. They were able to inform DeFelice's daughter the man suspected of murdering her mother was in custody. There is a concern that Nuttall has dementia and will be undergoing evaluations before the trial. LVMPD is looking to see if there are any more victims linked to Nuttall, who has resided in Las Vegas his whole life. After 4 decades, Sandra DeFelice will finally get justice." Let's get into it. Number 1. Stacy Lynn Jaworski. On the morning of December 16, 1988, 2 state transportation workers found the body of a very decomposed woman on the side of the Interstate 59 in Dade County, Georgia, close to the Alabama border. By that afternoon, authorities, including the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, arrived at the crime scene. The JBI found no identification on or around the body. They would try fingerprinting with no results. There was very little evidence found at the scene. However, they did find one piece of evidence that may have the killer's DNA on it. It would be saved, as there was not much they could do with evidence of this type in 1988. The JBI believed this woman may have been a hitchhiker who was picked up and then eventually dumped on the side of the road. Her body would have been there for days, if not weeks, before it had been found. She was believed to have been 20 to 25 years old. 125 pounds, and 5'7" tall. She had been wearing an extra-large navy blue thermal knit sweater, Calvin Klein blue jeans, a navy blue bra, and ankle-high black boots. She had worn a gold chain around her neck and a white gold heart-shaped ring on her left pinky finger. After an autopsy, it was discovered that she had been sexually assaulted before her death and had died from strangulation. Her death was ruled a homicide. The unknown woman would eventually be called Rising Fawn Jane Doe. They would try over the years to make updated sketches and clay renderings of what they believed Rising Jane Doe looked like in the hopes of identifying her. Authorities could not identify the Rising Jane Doe for 3 decades. In the mid-2000s, the case was reassigned. These new JBI investigators would find additional evidence that they could send to the FBI for further testing. They would be able to get a DNA profile of Rising Fawn Jane Doe and entered it to the missing person database. Unfortunately, they would not get a match. In 2015, Rising Fawn Jane Doe's case was reassigned, this time to the JBI Cold Case Unit. It was at this time they would be able to make new clay renderings and composite images of the victim. A social media campaign was undertaken, but again it did not lead to any positive identification. In March 2022, the JBI and FBI announced that they had finally identified this woman using genetic genealogy. They announced in a press conference that her name was Stacy Lynn Jaworski. Stacy had been reported missing by her mother in January 1989 from Michigan. Stacy was on a hitchhiking trip through the southern states in the fall of 1988. Her mother had reported her missing after she did not come home for Christmas as planned. Stacy was only 19 when she died. Stacy's mother has since identified the jewelry that was found with Stacy, and her remains have been sent to Michigan. And the case doesn't end there. In September, the JBI and FBI announced in a press conference that they identified Stacy's killer using the same genetic genealogy, making this the first case in Georgia where a victim and killer were identified with the same technology. Stacy's killer was identified as Henry Frederick Haas Wise. Wise was a truck driver who worked a route in the area driving through Chattanooga to Birmingham to Nashville. Wise was also a stunt driver, and in 1999 he died in a stunt car accident. He burned to death. He had a criminal history in several states, which included theft, assault, and obstruction of a police officer. His arrests all predated mandatory DNA testing for felony arrests. On September 6, 2022, the JBI press release stated this, quote, Mary Beth Smith, Stacy Jaworski's mother, expresses gratitude to the FBI, the JBI, Special Agent Adam James for his relentless pursuit of this case, and JBI forensic artist Marla Lawson for her work on the composite drawings and clay renderings. She also thanks Dade County Sheriff Ray Cross, all the people in Dade County who took care of Stacy as she was brought home to Norton Shores, Michigan, and the Norton Shores Police Department for never giving up on finding her. With very little evidence, the investigators in this case never stopped looking for answers. Number 2, Joette Smith. On March 29, 1983, a man was walking his dog on the banks of the San Lorenzo River on the 200 block of Woodland Drive in Ben Lamont, California, when he saw a body floating in the river. She only wore one nylon, a black boot, and a string of pearls. A navy blue cape was found nearby. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the crime scene, finding several other pieces of evidence. They quickly identified the woman as Joette Marie Smith. She was 33 and the owner of a popular local restaurant called Buffalo Gals. Joette was described as a remarkable woman, very hospitable, happy, cordial, a woman just full of vigor. She was always there when people needed her. She was last seen on March 28, 1983. Joette closed up the restaurant for the night and went across the street to her studio apartment, which she was sharing with a friend, Rachel Devereaux, at the time. Rachel would stay and work with Joette in the winter months, as her 46-acre property would be inaccessible during the winter rainy seasons. The two women watched the TV show Thunderbirds, ate some popcorn before Joette made some phone calls. Joette said she was tired and Rachel went to bed. Rachel woke up at 3 a.m. to find Joette not in the apartment. This was not unusual, as Joette often went to the restaurant late at night. Detectives would find out that Joette had left the apartment and walked to a local bar to buy cigarettes. She had tried one shop closer to home, but it was closed. So she had walked to Henfling's Inn, a bar in downtown Ben Lamont. A waitress there who knew Joette had offered her a ride home, but she said it was a lovely night and she wanted to walk. That would be the last known sighting of Joette alive. Detectives believe she might have been stopped on the bridge, which was on her way home. An autopsy would show that she'd been strangled to death and that there may have been a sexual element which they haven't released. Her death was ruled a homicide. There was not much for authorities to go on. They interviewed everyone in Joette's life, talked to people who saw her that night, and came up with nothing. Everyone they spoke to didn't think that Joette had any enemies. Authorities had physical evidence, but nothing to compare it to, and DNA testing was not being used yet. Joette had moved to Ben Lamont 10 years before and had been about to celebrate the 8th anniversary of owning the restaurant, and she had been planning a big anniversary celebration. She had moved from Colorado Springs, but had attended college in Kansas. She was originally from Omaha, Nebraska, where her family still resided. Her mother brought her remains back to Nebraska, where she now rests. There would be no leads in her case until 1988, when detectives would have a suspect, a man named Eric David Drummond. He had an extensive criminal history in California and Nevada, which included sexual assault. Detectives would learn that Drummond had asked Joette out on a date and she told him no. Drummond had left California quickly after the murder. They had circumstantial evidence connecting him to the crime, but no case could be brought against him without more physical evidence. Joette's case would eventually go cold. In 2022, her case was reopened in the hopes of using new DNA technology not available in 1983. They were able to get a male DNA sample from the 1983 evidence. In August of 2022, they were able to get a sample of DNA directly from Drummond, now 64 years old. The DNA sample was an exact match for the evidence sample. Unfortunately, while detectives were working on getting an arrest warrant, Drummond committed suicide in September. Though there would not be justice, the friends and family of Joette now have answers. They also input Drummond's DNA into CODIS and are looking to determine if there are any other cold cases that are linked back to him. Joette's sister said in a statement to the media, "A long time ago, I just came to the fact that they would probably never identify her killer. This announcement was a little bit of a letdown, but I don't feel like we didn't get justice. The DNA was a match, and it's closure." Number 3. The package killer identified. In 1991, several murdered women were determined by FBI profiles to be the work of one person, a serial killer named the package killer. On March 26, 1990, a body was found between two mattresses along the highway near Silex, Missouri in Lincoln County. Her hands were bound and her face was covered. An autopsy showed she'd been strangled to death. She was identified as Robin Myhan, a 19-year-old who lived in St. Louis, Missouri. She'd been living as a sex worker. On June 11, 1990, a body was found in a rubber trash can near Highway 55. The body was so decomposed that authorities could not determine the cause of death. She was later identified as Donna Reitmeyer, a 40-year-old woman who was last seen in the Stroll area of Cherokee Street in St. Louis. She was also a sex worker. On October 4, 1990, a woman's body was found by a jogger near Interstate 270 in a plastic trash can. She had been smothered or strangled. The woman remained unidentified for months, but was later identified as 27-year-old Brenda Pruitt, who lived on Cherokee Street, St. Louis. She was reported missing on May 9, 1990, by her family. On February 17, 1991, a body was found in a wooden box by the side of the Interstate 70 in O'Fallon, Missouri, and she was identified as Sandy Little, who was 21 years old and had been reported missing from her home on the 2800 block of Cherokee Street in September 1990. She was also a sex worker. All of these women were mothers with young children at home, disappearing only to be found months later disposed of like garbage. On October 12, 1990, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper reported that police had questioned a suspect, but the evidence was thin. I couldn't find any other reports, and no person was ever charged for these crimes in 1990. These cases went cold for decades. In 2008, Sergeant Jody Weber of O'Fallon Police Department took another hard look at these cases. These women were found in multiple jurisdictions, so Weber had to reach out and call each of them individually for their case files. For the next 14 years, she would organize evidence, witness statements, and police reports. Detective Weber would start sending physical evidence to crime labs. She constantly followed up to see if the crime labs had any new information. On April 2022, all the hard work would pay off. With new technology advancements, the St. Charles County Crime Lab was able to get a DNA match from a tiny bit of viable evidence. The match was to a convicted murderer, Gary Randall Muehlberg, who is currently serving a life sentence in Potosi Correctional Center for killing Kenneth Atchison in 1993 over a disagreement about money. He had hidden Kenneth's body in a homemade coffin in his basement and was arrested and charged with his murder in 1995. Detective Weber then went to the Potosi Correctional Center for 2 separate times and had showed Muehlberg the DNA evidence. In these interviews, he confessed to killing Myhan, Pruitt, and Little, and gave detailed accounts of the murders in the confession. After the second interview, he sent Detective Weber a letter telling her of 2 other murders he had committed. When she interviewed him a third time, he gave detailed accounts of the murders he had written in the letters. With that information, she could identify Reitmeyer as one of those victims. Unfortunately, with the information given, no other cases could be tied to the unknown Jane Doe Muehlberg had confessed to killing. In September of 2022, after a plea deal had been made to take the death penalty off the table, Gary Muehlberg was charged with the murders of Myhan, Pruitt, Little, and Reitmeyer. Law enforcement also revealed that there are more victims whose bodies had never been found or identified. They stated that Muehlberg is believed to be fully cooperating with law enforcement. In an article for St. Louis Public Radio, Jody Weber is quoted as saying, "I know it was a long time coming for me for 14 years. I couldn't imagine what it was like for a family member waiting 32 years for answers." With Muehlberg being incarcerated all this time, it also raises questions on if something was missed in the 1993 case he was sentenced for, and why it took so long to get a DNA hit. After 30 years and so many hours on this case, the package killer from 1991 has been identified. Law enforcement does want to make it clear that this case is not done. It remains an ongoing investigation that they are willing to work on.
I've been waiting since March 26, 1990, so 32 years.
Decades later, there is relief.
My mom can rest in peace now. Yeah.
This is one of the days that shows why we do this job.
Prosecutors in Lincoln, St. Charles, and St. Louis counties credit cooperation for the murder charges connected to the 1990s strangulations of Robin Myhan, Brenda Pruitt, Donna Reitmeyer, and Sandy Little.
Number 1. Lindy Sue Beekler. On December 5, 1975, Lindy Sue was discovered stabbed to death in her Lancaster, Pennsylvania apartment. Her aunt and uncle discovered her body soon after the attack around 8:30 p.m. There had been no sign of forced entry, and Lindy Sue had last been seen grocery shopping at 6:30 p.m., leading detectives to believe that she'd been attacked shortly after returning home. Her shopping bags were still on the dining room table. Lindy Sue was married, and her husband Phil was quickly cleared as a suspect. Her autopsy revealed she'd been stabbed 19 times with 2 different knives. One was still embedded in her neck and had come from within the home. The other wasn't found at the crime scene. It was a horrific scene and had been a violent death. Lindy had several defensive wounds on her hands and arms, but she fought back. At some point, she'd been able to injure her attacker, and blood evidence from an unknown male was able to be preserved. Unfortunately, despite an exhaustive investigation, all suspects in the case were able to be eliminated, and eventually, without anything new, the case went cold. Over the next 4 decades, the case would be reopened and re-examined. The DNA was retested in 1997 against all the suspects in the original investigation, but they were cleared. The foreign male DNA was uploaded to CODIS in 2000, and the FBI BAU reviewed the case and hypothesized that the killer was a male who knew Lindy and committed the crime in a fit of rage. When the Golden State Killer was identified using genetic genealogy in 2018, the Lancaster District Attorney's Office put forth Lindy Sue's cold case forward for consideration. The genetic genealogy testing was approved, and they began working with Parabon Nanolabs. In 2019, Parabon created a computer-generated image of what the suspect might have looked like based on his DNA. Next, they worked on a new method of establishing a family tree for the suspect.
As far as the genetic genealogy, because there were no genealogically promising individual genetic matches to the suspect's DNA in this case, for those of you who are following genetic genealogy, the matches were only 30 centimorgans and below, which is incredibly distant. For that reason, I had to pursue a novel, non-traditional strategy as a possible alternate avenue to identify potential persons of interest to the investigation. This approach relies on a survey of geographic and immigration patterns, as well as associated surnames, and it necessitated that the subject had deep roots in the local Lancaster, Pennsylvania community. The matches trees, the people that were sharing DNA with this unknown suspect, contained many recent immigrant families from the province of Catanzaro in Calabria, southern Italy. And historical sources revealed that the majority of the Italian immigrants in Lancaster were from a small town named Gasparina, which is in that province. So this was consistent with the patterns that I observed in the match data. And it was determined from my research that there were approximately 2,300 residents of Italian ancestry living in the city of Lancaster at the time of the crime. Local historical records from the early 20th century were thoroughly researched and surveyed for residents of Lancaster who listed their birthplace as Gasparina, Italy. From these records, a list of individuals and families local to Lancaster with roots in Gasparina was compiled and their surnames noted. Then I performed descendancy research from these families to identify their male descendants who were of the appropriate age to be a candidate to be our suspect. These individuals' family trees were then built out in order to determine if they were a full Italian ancestry and all of their ancestral lines originated in Gasparina or nearby, because that is what the match data and the snapshot predictions were telling us. This person needed to be a full ancestry from that area. Now, these restrictions further narrowed the scope of the subsequent research because there were very few individuals living in Lancaster at the time of the crime that were the right age, gender, and had a family tree consistent with these origins. So this allowed me to prioritize the candidates whose descent was determined to be exclusively from families with origins in Gasparina. And then each of those individuals was further investigated through newspaper archives, public people search databases, social media, court records, and other resources. Now, after months of this type of research, one individual was identified who I believed was an especially compelling candidate to possibly be the suspect. At that point, I turned that lead over to investigators. Investigative genetic genealogy like this should be treated only as a lead generator, a tip. It's a highly scientific tip, but the tip just the same. And so at that point, then investigators followed that tip, and you see the outcome today.
They were able to identify a suspect who was discovered to be living and had never moved from the Lancaster area. 65-year-old David Sinopoli had never been a suspect in the original investigation, but detectives learned he lived in the same building as the Beeklers in 1975. Sinopoli was placed under surveillance and was seen to have discarded a to-go coffee cup, which was collected and used to compare to the suspect's DNA. It was a confirmed match. Sinopoli was arrested at his home on December 11, 2022, nearly 47 years to the day of Lindy Sue's murder. Sinopoli didn't have a significant criminal history. In 2004, he pleaded guilty to invasion of privacy and disorderly conduct. He had been working at a tanning salon and admitted to spying on a woman tanning. Since then, he has kept a very low-profile life. He married in 1974, divorced in 1986, and was remarried a year later. He has 3 children, was an avid hunter, according to social media, and frequently traveled to Italy. He was charged with 1 count of criminal homicide and is being held without bail while he waits further court proceedings. No word yet on if he has any further court dates.
Lindy Sue Beekler was on the minds of many throughout the years. Certainly, law enforcement has never forgotten about her, and this arrest marks the first step in obtaining justice for Lindy Sue Beekler and holding her killer responsible.
Number 2, Betty Rolfe. It was during a blizzard on November 6, 1988, when Betty Rolfe decided to walk to work at the Appleton County Air Banquet Room in Appleton, Wisconsin. It wasn't her normal routine to walk to work, but 60-year-old Betty didn't like to drive in the snow, and her son wasn't able to give her a ride that morning. It shouldn't have taken her long. It was only 10 blocks from her home, but she never arrived. She was reported missing when her husband discovered she hadn't returned home from work. It was then that he learned she'd never arrived that day. Her body was found covered in gravel and partially clad under a railroad bridge 2 days later. An autopsy showed she'd been strangled to death, sexually assaulted, and beaten. The murder case shocked the community. Betty had been well known to the area, she was well liked. No one could imagine anyone setting out to hurt her. That, paired with the differentiation between her normal routine and the snowstorm, led law enforcement to believe it was a crime of opportunity. DNA evidence was collected at the time of the initial investigation, but all that could be done was tested against the suspects they had, which eliminated all. Eventually, the case went cold.
Police found the body of an unidentified woman in her early 60s in a ravine off Spencer Street at 11 o'clock this morning.
34 years ago. This is what Local 5's coverage of the cold case looked like.
We have a female adult who was found in the 1600 block of West Spencer Street at about 11 o'clock this morning. The cause of death at this time is undetermined.
For 34 years, law enforcement officers unsuccessfully searched for Betty Rolfe's killer.
In 2001, the DNA was input into CODIS, the federal database, and the state database, but nothing came up. In 2019, the case was reopened in hopes of using genetic genealogy to find a suspect. This year, they were able to narrow down the DNA to 2 brothers. Law enforcement approached one of the brothers, who cooperated with police but believed his brother to be deceased. He supplied a DNA sample which eliminated him as a suspect, leading law enforcement to believe that 66-year-old Gene C. Meyer of Tacoma, Washington, was their suspect. In the 80s, Meyer lived within a mile of Betty Rolfe and left Wisconsin shortly after her murder, relocating to Washington. Law enforcement in both states worked together to locate Meyer, and he was put under surveillance. Law enforcement were able to collect a DNA sample from the handle of his truck. Once it was positively matched with the suspect's DNA, he was arrested. He is currently being held and is awaiting extradition to Wisconsin. Number 3, Evelyn Fisher Bamforth. It was January 22, 1980 in Miramar, Florida, when Evelyn Fisher Bamforth opted to stay home for the evening. The 32-year-old nurse had hurt her knee and decided it would be best to rest it so she could get back to work. Her husband John went out for the evening. The couple were newly married. They had only just moved to Florida from the Cayman Islands. John worked in restaurants as a bartender and manager and was just settling into Miramar. Evelyn was from Chilliwack, British Columbia, and was a shining star in her family. The first to become a nurse in her family, and she was described as caring, smart, and a joy to be around. When John came home that evening, he said that he saw police tape on their front door advising no one to enter. He had no idea what was going on and entered anyway. Immediately, he noticed something was wrong. Furniture had been strewn about, and there was stuff everywhere. When he went into their bedroom, he said that their bed was half soaked in blood. Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. Law enforcement hadn't notified him or stayed at the crime scene. It would only be when he went to the police department that he was notified that his wife had been murdered earlier that evening. He was given little details about what had happened, and he was devastated by the news. A friend had discovered the murder when she forgot her keys and went over to Evelyn and John's house. She knew Evelyn was home that night and knew she was supposed to be in. She knocked on the door several times, but there was no answer. Then she saw one of the panes of glass next to the door had been broken and called the police. When police entered, they found Evelyn's body in the bedroom. She'd been brutally bludgeoned to death, and she'd been sexually assaulted. John had been at work, and his alibi was quickly cleared. Months later, they did have a strong suspect in the case, when another county's police department approached Miramar PD with a nearly identical murder. The suspect in that case was Ronald Eugene Richards. The 32-year-old was out on parole for murdering his girlfriend in 1975 in Ohio. When law enforcement went to question Richards, they discovered he lived only 12 doors down from Evelyn and John. The Miramar PD didn't have enough evidence to charge Richards, but in the other case, the Volusia County PD had enough to charge and arrested him. He was convicted in that case in 1982 and served 38 years in prison before he was released in 2020. In 2022, Evelyn's case was reopened and the evidence in the case was retested for DNA. There, they found a sample of foreign male DNA and ran it through CODIS. From there, they were able to positively identify it to Ronald Eugene Richards. Richard was out on probation and was quickly arrested in Ohio. He is now waiting to be extradited back to Florida, where he will be charged with Evelyn's murder. Miramar PD have also stated that they believe Richards was a serial predator and are looking to see if any other cold cases are connected to him. John, who now resides in the UK, has expressed relief about the new development. He said that the murder of his wife had a devastating impact on his life, leading to substance abuse to numb the guilt he felt, which became an issue he struggled with for decades. He told the media that despite the relief of the arrest, the news also brought up difficult memories. He said, quote, "But for Evelyn, justice is the most important thing."
I would certainly want to see justice for Evelyn. Yeah. And I don't believe in this closure thing. One never has closure.
No word yet on what is next for Richard. He may opt to take a plea agreement if offered. In Florida, the death penalty remains on the table at this time. Well, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. As always, if you want to support the channel, the easiest way is to hit the like button. You can also subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss my next upload. Other ways to support the channel are joining my Patreon or channel membership. I also have merch, and you'll find all the links in the description box, plus a few extras. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter for more. But with that being said, thank you so much for being here and supporting what I do. It is very appreciated. That is it for me. I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 5 cases where the person who served the prison sentence was discovered to have been wrongly accused. Let's get into it. We applaud the advances in forensic technology, helping to find justice for victims after decades. But sometimes, with these new advances, we also discover some of the people serving the time never committed the crime. Their lives and families were ripped apart, disrupted, and sometimes not getting exonerated for decades, only clearing their name after spending most of their life in prison. These are their stories. Number 1. Maurice Hastings. It was in 1983 in Inglewood, California, when Roberta Weidermeyer was abducted, murdered, and stuffed into the trunk of her own vehicle. Her cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the skull. Roberta had gone out for a late-night trip to the grocery store and was believed to have been attacked in the parking lot. Her husband and a friend had gone out searching for Roberta's car when she didn't return home. And when they found her vehicle, they said that they saw a man fleeing. One of the key attributes in their description was that the man was African American and tall. And several months after Roberta's murder, law enforcement arrested Maurice Hastings, who lived in the area. They picked him up and put him in a lineup with 6 others. The men picked Maurice from the lineup, and he went to trial for the murder of Roberta Weidermeyer. Maurice had always maintained his innocence with the claim that he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He also had multiple people able to confirm his alibi, but it didn't help. There had been no forensic evidence connecting him to the crime, and his trial exclusively relied on eyewitnesses who believed they had seen him driving Roberta's car. His first trial resulted in a hung jury, and he went to trial again, and this time was convicted. He faced the death penalty, but the jury recommended a life sentence. He was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Foreign male DNA was found on Roberta's body, but was never tested. Maurice had requested in an appeal in 2000 to have that DNA evidence tested, but a judge denied the appeal, upholding the conviction. In 2022, the Innocent Project took on Maurice's conviction, and with their help, the DNA evidence was located and tested. The DNA was determined not to be Maurice Hastings. It was, however, connected to a man that had been convicted of sexual assault and murder in a manner closely resembling how Roberta Weidermeyer was killed. That man had died in prison in 2020. On October 20th, 2022, the now 69-year-old Maurice Hastings was released with a full exoneration after serving 38 years in federal prison. Upon his release, Hastings said, "I prayed for many years that this day would come, and I'm not pointing fingers, I'm not standing up here a bitter man, but I just want to enjoy my life now while I have it."
Mr. Hastings maintained his innocence from the time police arrested him throughout 2 jury trials.
And this year, DNA testing proved his innocence and made him once again a free man on October 20th. But for 22 years, Hastings begged for DNA testing to be used in his case, and his requests were denied.
And they said, no, we don't have that evidence. We threw that away. We disposed of that, the evidence in my case. So they said that they got rid of it.
The district attorney's conviction integrity unit and the Innocence Project at Cal State LA worked together on Hastings' claim. And it wasn't until this summer that his DNA was submitted, showing his DNA did not match.
Thanks to modern science, we now know the identity of another man who we believe was involved in the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of Mrs. Weidermeyer.
With so many years lost, Hastings says he just wants to move forward and enjoy life, starting with the day he was released.
It was pretty festive. Me and the team of attorneys, my family, and we had lobster and we went to, and all of that. All of that was good. I haven't had that in quite a long time, so it was wonderful.
Number 2, Richard Knapp. It was in April 2019 when Washington State Police made an announcement hailing genetic genealogy for the recent arrest of a suspect believed to be responsible for the 1994 murder of Audrey Oline Frazier. Audrey was 26 years old when her body was discovered in her apartment after a neighbor called for a welfare check. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. At the time of the initial investigation, multiple sources of DNA were found in her body as well as in her apartment. In 2018, DNA from the case was sent to Parabon Nanolabs and a suspect was identified as Richard Knapp. Knapp had a sexual assault charge in 1986 that he was convicted for, which seemed to be why Knapp was arrested over the other suspects. Knapp maintained his innocence. When being interrogated about the crime, did not recall knowing Frazier, but did admit that at the time he was known to abuse substances, particularly alcohol, and frequent the same bars that she went to regularly, and recalled that at the time it wasn't uncommon for him to go home with women he met at the bar. He was arrested and charged in 2019 and held without bail while further court proceedings went forward. He spent 3 years in jail and was released on November 30th, 2022, now 63 years old. The courts determined there wasn't enough definitive evidence to connect him to Audrey Frazier's murder and instead are pursuing another suspect. Frazier's neighbor, who had called law enforcement to check on her, was also discovered to have been one of the sources of male DNA. His DNA was found in multiple areas of the crime scene. Police records show that he was interviewed at the time of the initial investigation and even admitted to having sex with the victim the night she was murdered. At this time, this man has not been charged, and other details have not been released as to why the Washington courts believe he is more likely a suspect in this murder investigation. Richard Knapp's lawyer made this statement to the media, quote, "Richard spent 1,312 days in jail. He lost his name, his job, his life. His wife died in June 2021. She went to sleep knowing they were together, although he was in jail. Richard has maintained his innocence since his arrest, and the decision today speaks for itself. Number 3, Horace Roberts. It was on April 13, 1998, when Terry Cheek didn't show up for work. She was reported missing, and 4 days later, her body was found abandoned on the shore of Corona Lake in Riverside, California. Terry had been strangled to death. The last people to see her alive were her 2 daughters and her husband, Googie Harris. The two were recently separated, with reports from friends and neighbors that Harris had been abusive. Despite that, he wasn't investigated for his wife's murder. Instead, law enforcement honed in on a relationship Terry was having with a co-worker, Horace Roberts. Horace was picked up and interrogated for hours. Initially, he lied about having an extramarital affair with Terry Cheek. He later stated that this was out of shame and embarrassment, but was seen by law enforcement as more than a guilty conscience, believing a man capable of lying about an affair was one capable of lying about murder. The physical evidence in the case was largely circumstantial. An eyewitness claimed to have seen a truck in the area where Terry's body was dumped, which matched Horace's vehicle, but there was nothing else to confirm other than a vague description. Terry's daughter also identified a purse found in Horace's home that she thought might have been something that her mother had worn the night she went missing. And a watch found at the crime scene was believed to have belonged to Horace, but this relied on eyewitnesses who believed Horace wore a similarly styled watch. No physical evidence directly tied Horace to the crime. Horace went through 3 full trials before a conviction stuck. The first 2 concluded with a hung jury. On July 16, 1999, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison for the murder of his girlfriend, Terry Cheek. Horace made several appeals to have the evidence in his case re-examined and maintained his innocence. In 2003, the Innocence Project became involved in his case, and they were able to determine that the prosecution had withheld evidence during his trial that would have likely led to a not guilty verdict. DNA testing of the watch determined that there was no DNA belonging to Horace Roberts, but they did find the DNA of 3 other men: Terry's husband, Googie Harris, his nephew, and another man. The rope used to strangle Terry was also tested, and again there was no DNA that matched Horace, but it did match her husband. It was determined that Googie Harris murdered his wife when he discovered she was seeing a coworker, and then he framed his wife's lover for her murder. In 2013, a petition was sent to have a new trial and to include the new DNA evidence, but the petition was denied. More DNA testing of crime scene evidence went forward to further support Horace's innocence. He was also offered a plea bargain, which would have allowed him to be released from prison with time served if he admitted guilt, but he refused, determined to clear his name and have the conviction vacated. In 2018, even more DNA evidence was put forward. This time, there were fingernail clippings from Terry's body that matched her husband's nephew. A blood stain on her pants was also tested and did not match Horace. With all the evidence together, Horace Hastings' petition to vacate his sentence was granted. His release proceedings were initially sealed from the public, and he was released on October 3, 2018, with a certificate of innocence after serving nearly 2 decades behind bars. Googie Harris, his son Googie Harris Jr., and Joaquin Leal were charged with Terry Cheek's murder in 2019. All 3 pleaded guilty and were sentenced in 2022. In 2019, Roberts sued Riverside County and the Sheriff's Department for mishandling evidence and was awarded $11 million in damages. Roberts, now 63, has been reunited with his family, which include his 2 daughters, now in their 40s, and are catching up on missed time with them.
It is a reunion 20 years in the making. The last time Horace Roberts held his son, Brandon was 8 years old. He's now 28. As father and son walk through this airport in South Carolina, they're heading for another monumental moment as Horace falls into the arms of his wife, Deborah, seeing her too for the first time in 20 years.
Oh my goodness. Deborah is my right hand and my left hand. She stuck by me from the beginning to the end.
Horace was convicted in 1999 for a murder he did not commit. DNA evidence led police to new suspects and new evidence that prove he's an innocent man. All charges against him have been dismissed, and he's been declared factually innocent.
Yeah, come on.
As he picks up his 3-year-old grandson he's never seen until this moment.
Okay.
He heads for his oldest daughter, Fanchette, who's now 40 years old. She was 20 when her dad was taken away from her.
Yeah, this is the good one. Yeah,
Next, he spots his youngest daughter, Candace.
Hey, here come my baby right here.
She's Brandon's twin sister. She, too, was 8 years old the last time she saw her dad.
What'd she say? Oh, we nice and old. I tried hard to instill good values to them, how to be honest and productive in life.
Horace Roberts might have been released on parole 10 years ago if he'd said he was guilty, that he was sorry and apologized for crimes he did not commit, but instead he proclaimed his innocence year after year, decade after decade.
Because I didn't do it, and I refused to allow the system to rob me of what I had left. You took my pride, you took my dignity, you stole my self-worth. I was not gonna give you my soul.
And now he is a free man with simple dreams to hold on to his family and never let go.
I'm glad to be home, and I'm never leaving them again. Thank God. I'm free at last. I'm free at last.
Number 4, Anthony Powell. On March 20th, 1991, an 18-year-old was abducted in Roxbury, Massachusetts. The teen was waiting for the bus home, and it had been around midnight when an unknown man approached the girl. The man had a knife and forced her to walk to a wooded area where he sexually assaulted her, then ran away. The girl went to the police and described her attacker as a clean-shaven African-American man. She said he was around 5'10", 200 pounds, wore his hair in a very specific style, which included having letters shaved into his scalp. That same evening, law enforcement picked up several men, which included 23-year-old Anthony Powell. But what was odd was that Anthony had a full head of hair, no shaved areas or letters, and also had a mustache. He was included in a photo lineup and given to the victim, who selected his photos as most closely resembling her attacker. He maintained his innocence throughout the entire ordeal. From there, Anthony was charged and went to trial a year later. During his trial, though DNA evidence existed and was available, it was not tested for Anthony's defense. At the time, Massachusetts was the only one of 2 states that didn't require DNA evidence to be preserved from criminal investigations. They also didn't have any laws requiring DNA testing to be undertaken for those accused to aid in their defense. In Anthony's case, a judge decided DNA testing would be unnecessary for the trial, and because of that, the evidence was never compared to Anthony. On September 14, 1992, a jury found Anthony Powell guilty, and he was sentenced to 12 to 20 years in prison. Anthony's family needed to make an impossible choice. They could only afford to either hire a lawyer to help Anthony file an appeal or have the DNA evidence tested privately. They thought the appeal lawyer was the most immediate need, but they were unsuccessful in their appeals. After Anthony's incarceration, there were multiple attacks that bore a striking resemblance to the crime Anthony had been in prison for, which had occurred after he had been arrested. In '95, the cases were grouped together under the name John Doe. There had been a suspect arrested in at least one of the cases, but the victim declined to prosecute and he was released. In 2002, Anthony Powell was finally allowed to have the DNA evidence tested. After his conviction, the evidence in his case had been scheduled to be disposed of, but miraculously someone had forgotten to do that, and it was found in an evidence locker a decade later. The evidence was tested, and the DNA collected from the rape kit did not match Anthony Powell. On March 4, 2004, almost 12 years to the day that Anthony had been arrested, simply for being at the wrong place at the wrong time, he was released when his conviction was vacated. Years later, it was determined that the man who had actually committed this attack and a series of other serial assaults was Jerry Dixon. He had a long criminal history of assault, armed robbery, and multiple motor vehicle offenses, and during an arrest in 2007, he had been required to submit DNA because he was deemed to be a violent offender. Once submitted to CODIS, his DNA matched a string of serial sexual assaults in the 90s. Many were perpetrated after Powell was arrested for a crime he committed. He was arrested and pleaded guilty to 3 sexual assaults on July 28, 2011. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Anthony Powell filed a civil rights lawsuit with the city of Boston and the state. Both cases settled, and he was awarded just over $4 million in damages for the 12 years he spent in prison. In a statement to the media, he said, quote, "If you think an innocent person cannot be convicted of a crime in Massachusetts, you're fooling yourself. It happened to me. There are innocent people in prison right now." Powell's release defied the odds. He had received assistance from the New England Innocence Project, and in this case, the evidence was still available for testing. Since Powell's release, 9 other men in the state have been released after DNA evidence was recovered and tested after years. Number 5. Lydell Grant. It was close to midnight on December 10, 2010 in Houston, Texas, when Aaron Shearhorn was attacked just outside of a nightclub. The 28-year-old had approached a group of people, opened up his shirt, and revealed he'd been stabbed and needed help. While trying to get help, the attacker approached the man in the group of people, and Aaron ran into a nearby parking lot where the attacker followed and stabbed him several times, with several witnesses watching. Then Aaron collapsed, and the attacker calmly walked away. Aaron Shearhorn was rushed to the hospital, but later died to the extensive injuries he sustained in the attack. According to witness statements, the attack happened so fast, and only a couple had seen the attack in full. Most of the others had only seen bits and pieces. Despite the numerous witnesses, no one could remember anything that stood out about the attacker. They described him as average height, average build with short hair, not exactly the most information to go on. The next night, one of the witnesses called Crime Stoppers because they saw a man who looked like the attacker. The man had gotten out of a vehicle and walked away. The witness approached the vehicle, which was empty, and he wrote down the license plate, which was passed on to law enforcement. The vehicle was registered to 33-year-old Houston resident Lydell Grant. They pulled up a photo of Lydell and showed it to the witnesses. Some of them believed the image was that of the attacker. The remaining weren't sure or didn't believe the attacker looked like Lydell. Lydell had a criminal history of petty theft, stealing credit cards, fraud, and possession of cannabis, and he'd been in prison before, but he had attributed that to hanging out with the wrong crowd in his youth. On December 15th, Lydell was stopped for a traffic violation, and when Houston police pulled up his information, they discovered a warrant for his arrest. When the officer told him he was wanted for murder and there had been witnesses that identified him, he said, quote, "I don't care if you have 6 million witnesses. I didn't kill him." His vehicle was searched, and there was a Halloween mask, a wig, and a knife. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. None of the items ever had any connection to Aaron's murder. Lydell maintained his innocence all throughout the pretrial hearings. He was held in custody while he awaited trial. DNA from Aaron's body was tested before the trial began, and under his fingernails was found 2 sources of DNA. Neither was found to have come from Lydell Grant, but the test was deemed inconclusive for trial. Additionally, the witnesses who didn't believe Lydell was the man they saw attack Aaron were barred from testifying. Lydell had an alibi for the time when Aaron was murdered, and that witness also testified for the jury. Despite having no physical evidence tying him to the crime, having an alibi that was able to be corroborated, it wasn't enough. On December 6, 2012, a jury convicted Lydell Grant of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. He filed for an appeal in 2014, but his conviction was upheld. In 2015, his lawyer asked to have the evidence tested for DNA, which was declined. In 2018, his case caught the attention of the Innocence Project of Texas, who selected the case as a case study for the Texas A&M School of Law. They began to go through the case, starting from the ground up. The law students reviewed the data from the DNA analysis and soon noticed that the data clearly excluded Lydell's DNA from the sample, which should have been clear to the forensic examiner who reviewed the data for trial. The data files were sent to Cybergenetics Corp in Pittsburgh, where they asked to have an expert review the data. The Cybergenetics reviewed and gave a similar answer. Lydell's DNA was not found under Aaron Shearhorn's fingernails. Lawyers petitioned to have the unknown individual's DNA submitted to CODIS, which was approved in 2019. The DNA hit a convicted felon, 41-year-old Jamerico Carter. Carter lived in Houston at the time and had been convicted in 2018 for a murder that had striking similarity to Aaron Shearhorn's murder. Lydell's legal team petitioned all the evidence in this case to be retested, including the items found in his vehicle, confirming again that Lydell's DNA was not found on Aaron's body and that there was no DNA found on the knife that had been found in his car. While they were going through all the evidence in this case, they also discovered a recorded police interview where Jamerico Carter confessed to killing Aaron Shearhorn. Lydell's legal team also brought in a psychologist who reviewed the trial transcripts and the witness testimonies and testified that, in her opinion, the witness testimonies should be looked at with more scrutiny, testifying that there were multiple reasons why witnesses to crimes have a hard time identifying the attacker. In this case, they were likely more focused on the knife than the attacker's face. She also stated that the witnesses weren't separated when they identified Grant from the lineup, and the witnesses being together inflated their confidence in the identification. One of the witnesses years later said that officers pressured him to select Lydell as the attacker. On May 19, 2021, all the new evidence was put forward to the Court of Criminal Appeals, and they motioned to vacate the conviction. Lydell Grant was found to be innocent of the crime he had been convicted of. Lydell had spent nearly a decade in prison and would have served more for a crime he had never committed. He was able to have his record expunged and was also awarded almost $675,000 from the state as compensation for his time incarcerated.
I feel rejuvenated. I feel free now. It was a long time coming. I always claim my innocence. I just thank God to the Innocent Project. They really, they believed in me. They took my case and they worked it. I think the supporters, my family, y'all can see I got a beautiful family. Man, it's wonderful. God is good. Always know that God is good, man. God is wonderful because He was there for me when I ain't have nobody. God was there for me.
Well, that is it for this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you like this content and what I do over here, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss my next upload. As always, if you can give this video a like if you enjoyed the content, as that is the easiest way to help the channel grow, that would be much appreciated. We also have channel membership or Patreon if you want to get more behind the scenes content as well as exclusive content or just to support the channel. In the description box of this video, you also find links to all my socials to connect with me as well as other goodies. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you on the next one. Bye for now.